The first call came at 3 in the morning, a time reserved for emergencies and bad news. It was the kind of call that slices through the comfortable disbelief of a rational world, the one where Alex, a journalist by trade and a skeptic by nature, had built his entire career. His friend, Mark, was gone, not misplaced, not out of contact, but vanished into the thin, cold air of the A1, one of Britain's most infamous and haunted roads. The police report was a masterpiece of frustrating logic. Car found abandoned, engine cold, no signs of a struggle, no evidence of foul play. Just an empty vehicle on a dark stretch of asphalt, as if the earth had simply opened up and swallowed him whole. It was that maddening lack of evidence, that void where answers should have been, that finally pushed Alex into action. He could not accept the official conclusion, a simple case of a man walking away from his life. He knew Mark, and he knew the stories. For years they had been a source of late-night amusement, a catalogue of spectral hitchhikers, phantom coaches, and disembodied hands that populated the folklore of Britain's highways. Alex had always dismissed them as the products of overactive imaginations and poor lighting. Now they felt less like campfire tales and more like a map. Standing in his flat, surrounded by the quiet hum of his own normal life, Alex made a decision. He would investigate them all 25 of the most haunted roads in the UK. He would start where Mark ended, on the A1, and he would not stop until he found a thread to pull, a crack in the solid wall of the rational world through which his friend had seemingly disappeared. Packing his car was a methodical, almost ritualistic process. He loaded his professional gear first, a high-sensitivity digital recorder for electronic voice phenomena, a full-spectrum camera, a high-powered torch, and a rugged laptop. Then came the personal items, the things that anchored him to reality: a thermos for coffee, a well-worn map of the British Isles, with the 25 roads already circled in red ink, and a photograph of him and Mark grinning foolishly on a hiking trip in the Lake District. That photo was his tether, the proof of a life that was real and tangible. As he zipped up his duffel bag, his mind drifted through the archives of eerie stories he had once scorned. He recalled the legend of the hairy hands of Dartmoor, invisible forces that wrestled control from drivers on the B3212. He pictured the grey lady of the A9, a forlorn spirit forever searching for her lost child. He remembered the chilling account of the vanishing hitchhiker on the A1, a story that now felt terrifyingly personal. Each tale was a piece of a puzzle, a fragment of a hidden Britain that existed just beyond the periphery of headlights and common sense. A cold knot of doubt tightened in his stomach. What was he doing? Chasing ghosts? He was a journalist, not a paranormal investigator. His byline was built on facts, on corroborated sources and verifiable data. This entire quest was the antithesis of everything he believed in. Yet, beneath the doubt, a fierce, burning curiosity had taken root. It was the same curiosity that had driven him to become a journalist in the first place, the need to uncover the truth, no matter how strange or unsettling it might be. He slid into the driver's seat, the leather cool against his back. The early morning sky was a deep, bruised purple, bleeding into dawn at the horizon. He placed the photograph of Mark on the passenger seat, a silent passenger for the journey ahead. Turning the key, the engine rumbled to life, a familiar and comforting sound. He pulled away from the curb, leaving the safety of the known behind. The road stretched out before him, a grey ribbon leading into the heart of the unknown. He was no longer just a skeptical journalist. He was a man on a quest, driving headlong into the whispered legends of Britain, determined to find his friend and, in the process, perhaps find a truth that would shatter his world forever. The A1 unspooled before him, a relentless grey river of tarmac cutting through the muted greens and browns of the Northumberland countryside. It was a road of stark contrasts, where modern service stations with their glaring neon signs stood just miles from ancient, crumbling castles that watched the traffic pass with stone-faced indifference. Alex drove with a journalist's focus, his eyes scanning not just the road, but the verges, the laybys, the very quality of the light. This was where Mark had last been seen. Every shadow felt significant, every flicker of movement in the peripheral vision a potential clue. His first stop was a transport cafe just outside Alnwick, a place that smelled of strong tea, fried food, and diesel fumes. It was a hub for those who knew the road's secrets, the long-haul lorry drivers who spent more time on the A1 than in their own homes. He found his contact, a burly man named Dave, sitting in a corner booth, cradling a chipped mug. Dave had the weary eyes of a man who had seen too many miles and too many late nights. Alex slid into the booth opposite him, the recorder placed discreetly on the table between them. Dave's story tumbled out in a low, gravelly monotone, stripped of drama but heavy with a conviction that made the fine hairs on Alex's arms stand up. It had been on a stretch near Berwick-upon-Tweed, well past midnight, the road empty and black. He'd seen a young woman, no more than 20, thumbing a lift. She was dressed in a light summer dress, despite the chill, her face pale and drawn. Something in her desperation had compelled him to stop. She'd slid into the passenger seat, offering a quiet word of thanks. Dave remembered the cold that had entered the cab with her, a deep, penetrating chill that the heater couldn't combat. They'd driven in silence for a few minutes, before he'd asked where she was headed. When he glanced over for her answer, the seat was empty. The door was still locked from the inside. The only evidence she had ever been there was the lingering, bone-deep cold and the faint floral scent of perfume hanging in the air. Dave's hands, resting on the table, were steady, but his eyes were haunted. He wasn't a man given to fantasy. He was a man of gears and timetables. He had seen what he had seen. Alex thanked him, the recorder capturing the heavy silence that followed the story. Leaving the cafe, the bright afternoon sun felt thin and insubstantial, failing to warm the chill that had settled in his own bones. Back on the road, Alex replayed the interview in his mind. He tried to rationalize it, a trick of the light, a moment of micro-sleep, a prank. But Dave's raw, unshakable certainty was a splinter in his skepticism. As dusk began to bleed the color from the landscape, Alex continued his drive, his senses heightened. He passed the stretch Dave had described, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. It was then that the temperature in the car plummeted. One moment it was comfortable, the next it was a freezer, his breath pluming in the air before him. He fumbled for the climate controls, turning the heat to maximum, but the cold was unnatural, emanating from the empty passenger seat itself. A shiver, entirely separate from the temperature, traced a path down his spine. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. For a fraction of a second, a shadow flitted through the back seat, a human-shaped darkness that was there and then gone, leaving only the impression of movement. He snapped his head around, heart hammering against his ribs, but the seat was empty. The car felt suddenly crowded, occupied by a presence he could not see. He was alone on a darkening road, with a cold spot that defied physics and fleeting shadows in his mirrors. The legend of the vanishing hitchhiker was no longer just a story in a file. It was in his car, breathing its icy breath down his neck. The cold became a living thing, a predatory chill that coiled through the car's interior, seeping through his jacket and gnawing at his bones. Alex's breath continued to fog the air, a frantic silver plume in the dim light from the dashboard. He stared at the empty passenger seat, his mind racing through a catalogue of rational explanations, a faulty heater core, a sudden temperature inversion, anything to anchor himself to the world he understood. But the cold had a source, a focal point in that vacant space beside him, and it carried the scent of rain-damp earth and old roses, the same floral ghost Dave had described. Then, the air in the passenger seat shimmered, like heat haze over summer tarmac. It wavered, coalescing, pulling substance from the frigid air. One moment there was nothing. The next, a young woman sat beside him. She was there with the sudden, jarring finality of a slammed door. Her form was translucent, a photograph laid over reality, her features pale and finely drawn. She wore a simple, light-colored dress, its hem faintly tattered, and her hands were clasped neatly in her lap. She did not look at him, but stared straight ahead through the windscreen at the unspooling darkness of the A1. A soft, sighing whisper filled the car, a sound that seemed to form not in the air but directly inside his mind. "Just to the next junction, please." The words were polite, plaintive, and utterly devoid of warmth. They echoed in the silent, frozen space, a request from another world. Instinct, a primal shriek of terror, seized him. Alex jerked the steering wheel, his body moving before his mind could process the impossibility before him. The tires screeched a protest against the asphalt, the car lurching violently across the empty lane. For a heart-stopping second, he felt the sickening loss of control, the vehicle teetering on the edge of the tarmac, gravel spraying from the wheels as he fought to correct the swerve. He wrenched the wheel back, the car fishtailing before straightening, his pulse a deafening drum in his ears. He gasped, his hands trembling so violently he could barely keep his grip. He dared another glance to his right. The seat was empty. The girl was gone, not vanished in a blink, but faded, her form dissolving back into the shimmering air until nothing remained. The crushing, supernatural cold vanished with her, the car's heater suddenly battling back with a blast of warm, mundane air. The only evidence of her presence was the faint, fading trace of that floral perfume, and the stark, trembling memory burned onto his retinas. He guided the shaking vehicle onto the next lay-by, the wheels crunching on loose chippings. He killed the engine, and in the sudden silence, the only sound was his own ragged, panicked breathing. He sat there for a long time, his forehead pressed against the cool steering wheel, waiting for his heart to slow its frantic rhythm. The solid, real world of the car, the smell of old coffee and leather, felt like a fragile illusion. The wall of his skepticism, so carefully constructed over a lifetime, had not just cracked, it had been utterly demolished. With hands that still trembled, he reached for his digital recorder, his movements slow and deliberate. He clicked it on, the red light a tiny, unwavering eye in the dark. His voice, when it came, was hoarse, stripped of its usual journalistic authority. Log entry, a 1 north of Berwick, time 21:47. He paused, swallowing hard. The subject manifested, fully, in the passenger seat, female, late teens or early 20s, period dress translucent, audible vocalization, a request for a ride. He described the cold, the scent, the swerve, the fading. He documented it all, every impossible detail, his words a stark contrast to the clinical tone he usually employed. This was not a second-hand account from a truck driver in a cafe. This was his own testimony. He was no longer an investigator on the outside looking in. He was a witness. The haunted roads of Britain had reached out and touched him, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him deeper than any ghostly presence, that this was only the beginning. The legend of the road was not a ghost you saw, but one you felt, a primal physical violation that seized you in the dark. Alex had heard the stories of the B3212 across Dartmoor, tales not of apparitions, but of invisible, brutish hands that materialized from the ether to wrestle control of the steering wheel, guiding drivers toward ditches and stone walls with malevolent force. After the chilling, ethereal encounter on the A1, this felt different, more visceral, a threat of pure physics and shattered metal. He drove into the heart of the moor as afternoon began to wane, the landscape unfolding in a vast, treeless expanse of bog and granite. Tors rose like broken teeth against a sky the color of slate, and a thin, persistent mist clung to the hollows, blurring the line between earth and air. His destination was a remote pub in Postbridge, a low, stone-built building that seemed to grow from the moor itself. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of peat smoke and old wood. He found the man he was looking for in a corner, a weathered farmer named John Tregear, whose own encounter had become local law. Tregear's face was a road map of hard living. His hands, resting on his pint, were large and calloused, the hands of a man who knew real, tangible work. He regarded Alex with a steady, grim gaze, no trace of the dramatic storyteller in his demeanor. Tregear's story was spare and brutal. He'd been driving the B3212 late one night, his old Land Rover loaded with feed. Without warning, an immense, unseen pressure had clamped down on the steering wheel, a force so powerful and sudden it felt like another man was in the cab with him, fighting for control. He described the sensation not as cold, but as a strange, electric warmth, and the distinct, horrifying impression of thick, hairy fingers digging into his own. For a terrifying, elongated minute, he had fought a desperate, silent tug-of-war with nothingness, the vehicle swerving violently across the narrow road. Before the force abruptly vanished, he'd found himself stalled in the middle of the lane, his heart trying to beat its way out of his chest, the memory of that coarse phantom hair against his skin making him shudder for days. As Alex listened, the cozy warmth of the pub felt like a lie. Tregear's account carried the weight of raw, unvarnished truth. This was not a story about a lost soul, it was a report of an attack. Leaving the pub, the mist had thickened into a proper Dartmoor fog, a rolling, opaque wall that swallowed the world beyond the bonnet of his car. He turned onto the B3212, the tarmac slick and dark, the stone walls on either side appearing and disappearing like ghosts in the swirling grey. He drove slowly, his senses screaming, every tiny bump in the road feeling like a prelude. The fog pressed against the windows, a damp, sound-absorbing blanket that isolated him completely. Then, as he navigated a long, sweeping bend, he felt it. A subtle, insistent tug on the steering wheel, a pressure trying to turn the car to the left, toward the looming shadow, a granite embankment. It was not his imagination. It was a definite physical force, an invisible palm pushing against his own. His breath hitched. He tightened his grip, muscles coiling, and fought back, correcting the wheel's trajectory back to the center of the lane. The pressure held for a moment longer, a silent, testing struggle, then released. The steering went light in his hands once more. He was alone again, his heart thudding, driving blind through a fog that now felt alive with a waiting, predatory presence. The hairy hands were no longer just a farmer's story. They were here, on this road, and they had just introduced themselves. Darkness fell upon Dartmoor like a shroud, absolute and suffocating. The fog, a conspirator in the road's grim legend, thickened until the headlights of Alex's car became two futile, glowing orbs pushing against a wall of solid grey. He drove at a crawl, the world reduced to a 10-foot bubble of slick tarmac and the frantic swish of the wipers. Every nerve was taut, his knuckles bone-white on the steering wheel, his body braced for the touch he now knew was coming. The memory of that initial testing tug was a fresh brand on his mind, a promise of violence yet to be fulfilled. It began not as a tug, but as a sudden immense weight. The steering wheel grew heavy in his hands, the power steering straining as if the tires were mired in deep mud. Then came the pressure, a brutal, undeniable force that clamped down on the wheel, twisting it counterclockwise. This was no subtle suggestion, this was an assault. Alex grunted, his arms bulging as he threw his entire weight against it, fighting to keep the car on its true course. The sensation was exactly as John Tregear had described. A strange electric warmth blooming through the leather of the wheel, and the horrifying, distinct impression of thick, coarse hair brushing against the backs of his own clenched fingers. It was a vile, intimate contact, the feel of something primal and inhuman. The car veered sharply left, tires screeching in protest. The left side wheels thumped over the rough grass verge, the chassis lurching violently. Through the fog, the dark, jagged outline of a granite outcrop loomed, rushing toward the driver's side window. A scream lodged in his throat, choked back by sheer, survivalist fury. He was not just fighting for control of a vehicle, he was fighting for his life against an enemy he could not see. He planted his foot, not on the brake, but on the accelerator, yanking the wheel back to the right with a raw, guttural shout. The engine roared, the back end sliding on the damp grass before the tires found purchase on the asphalt again. For a heart-stopping moment, the invisible hands maintained their grip, the wheel shuddering violently in the struggle between man and phantom. Then, with a final, vicious shove from Alex, the pressure vanished. The steering wheel spun freely for a terrifying second before he regained full control, the car lurching back into the center of the lane. He gasped, his body trembling with adrenaline and terror, the phantom sensation of that coarse hair still itching on his skin. He didn't slow down. He accelerated, pushing the car through the fog, desperate to put distance between himself and that cursed stretch of road. He drove for another 10 minutes, until his breathing began to steady and the trembling in his hands subsided to a faint quiver, before finally pulling into a designated passing place, the engine idling roughly. In the sudden, eerie quiet, broken only by the tick of the cooling engine and the patter of condensation on the roof, a new sound emerged, a faint, rhythmic scratching. It seemed to come from the passenger side door, a dry, persistent sound, like long, unkempt fingernails being dragged slowly down the exterior metal. Scratch, pause, scratch. It was a sound of deliberate, patient malice. Alex sat frozen, staring at the fogged window, half expecting to see a grotesque, hairy handprint smeared across the glass. With meticulous, slow movements, afraid that any sudden noise would provoke another attack, he reached for his digital recorder. He switched it on, holding it up toward the window. The tiny machine was more than capable of capturing the subtle, sinister noise. He let it run for a full minute, the scratching occasionally varying in pace and pressure, a ghostly vandal marking its territory. Finally, the sound ceased, leaving a silence that felt heavier and more menacing than before. He stopped the recording, his hand shaking as he placed the device back on the passenger seat. He had escaped the physical manifestation, but the B3212 had left its mark, a cold dread in his heart, and the audio evidence of an unseen, scratching presence that now felt forever tied to the sound of his own fear. The M6 was a different beast entirely from the lonely, atmospheric roads of the north and the moors. It was a roaring, relentless artery of commerce and travel, a multi-lane torrent of steel and light that carved through the industrial heartland of England. For Alex, the sheer volume of life on the motorway was a jarring transition. After the intimate terrors of the A1 and the primal struggle on the B3212, the constant rush of lorries, the glare of headlights, and the impersonal sprawl of service stations felt almost alien. Yet, the legend here was just as persistent, whispered among long-distance drivers and local police alike, the phantom hitchhiker of the M6. This was not a story of a single tragic figure, but a recurring apparition reported by multiple unrelated drivers over decades. The descriptions were always the same. A man, middle-aged, dressed in drab post-war clothing, seen thumbing a lift on the hard shoulder, usually on a specific stretch near Stafford. Those who stopped, or even those who just slowed to look, reported the same chilling phenomenon. The figure would simply be gone by the time their vehicle drew level, leaving behind nothing but a profound sense of unease and a sudden, inexplicable drop in temperature inside the car. Alex drove the southern section of the motorway as evening settled in, the sky bleeding from orange to deep violet. He kept to the middle lane, his speed a steady, unremarkable 70 miles per hour, his eyes constantly scanning the hard shoulder. The rational part of his mind argued that on a road this busy, any figure would be noticed by dozens of drivers causing chaos, but his recent experiences had taught him that the supernatural did not play by the rules of traffic density. It appeared where and when it chose, visible only to those it wished to see it. He passed the junction for Stafford, the landscape opening up into flat fields divided by skeletal winter hedgerows. The traffic began to thin as the night deepened, the endless stream condensing into isolated pockets of light. It was then, in a lull between passing lorries, that he saw it. A solitary figure standing on the hard shoulder, just beyond the glow of an overhead gantry. His form was stark and motionless against the dark backdrop of a field, one arm raised, the hand curled in the universal, pleading gesture of a hitchhiker. Alex's breath caught in his throat. He instinctively checked his mirrors and began to signal, easing his foot off the accelerator to move into the inside lane. His journalist's mind was already racing, a plan forming to pull over ahead of the figure, to be waiting for it. As his car slowed, its headlights swept across the spot where the man had been standing. The beam illuminated empty tarmac, a discarded drinks can, and nothing more. The figure was gone. It had not walked away, nor ducked behind the crash barrier. It had simply ceased to exist between one heartbeat and the next. A coldness, familiar and unwelcome, seeped into the car. It was not the deep, invasive freeze of the A1 ghost, but a swift, sharp chill that raised goosebumps on his arms, before dissipating as quickly as it had come. He accelerated back to cruising speed, his eyes glued to the rearview mirror, but the hard shoulder remained obstinately empty. The encounter had lasted less than 5 seconds, a fleeting, silent tableau witnessed only by him. There was no struggle, no physical manifestation, no whispered plea, just an apparition that presented itself and then withdrew, a ghostly thumbed ride offered and then rescinded. Yet, the unease it left behind was profound. It was the feeling of being tested, of being seen by something that existed just outside the flow of time and traffic, a lonely sentinel on Britain's busiest road, whose purpose remained as mysterious and unsettling as the empty space where he had stood. The phantom's fleeting appearance on. The hard shoulder was a hook set deep in Alex's mind, a silent challenge he could not ignore. The next day was spent not on the motorway, but in its shadow, chasing the echoes of the ghost through the living. He tracked down 2 of the witnesses, whose accounts were buried in local newspaper archives and paranormal forums. The first was a retired nurse named Sarah, who had been driving home from a night shift nearly 20 years earlier. Her story was a mirror of his own experience, the sudden sighting of the man in the drab coat, the decision to slow and offer help, the heart-lurching moment of his disappearance, and the swift, inexplicable chill that had filled her car. The second was a younger man, a courier named Liam, who had seen the figure just 6 months prior. His account was identical in every detail, down to the specific stretch of road and the unnerving silence that followed the vanishing. Sitting in a service station cafe, the hum of the M6, a constant drone beyond the glass, Alex pored over his notes. The consistency was unnerving. This was not a story that evolved or was embellished over time. It was a fixed event, a recording stuck on a loop, replaying for different drivers across decades. The ghost was not interactive like the girl on the A1. It was a phenomenon, an imprint. But imprints, he had learned, always had an origin. He spent the afternoon in a local library, scrolling through microfiche records of old newspapers, his eyes straining in the dim light. He searched for accidents, for disappearances, for any tragedy linked to that specific stretch of the M6 near Stafford. The breakthrough came not from a major headline, but from a small, 2-paragraph story buried in a regional paper from 1959. It detailed a hit-and-run on the then-new motorway. A pedestrian, a 42-year-old factory worker named Arthur Proudfoot, had been struck and killed while walking along the hard shoulder after his car had broken down. The driver had never been found. The date, the location, the description of the victim's clothing, it was a perfect match. Arthur Proudfoot was his phantom. Armed with this grim certainty, Alex returned to the M6 that night. The knowledge changed the quality of the darkness, giving the tarmac a tragic weight. He drove the same stretch, his speed deliberate, his senses attuned not just to the possibility of a sighting, but to the resonance of a specific unresolved death. He didn't have to wait long. The figure appeared again, materializing on the hard shoulder, as if stepping through a veil from 1959, his arm raised in that same timeless plea. This time, Alex did not slow. He maintained his speed, his eyes locked on the apparition. As his car drew level, the interior temperature plummeted in a single violent gust. The cold was so sharp it felt like a physical blow. And then, for just a second, the ghost was in the passenger seat. There was no gradual materialization, no shimmering air. One moment the seat was empty, the next, the translucent form of Arthur Proudfoot was sitting there, his face a mask of quiet desperation, staring straight ahead. He was there for less than the span of a single heartbeat. A photograph flashed before Alex's eyes before he was gone. The car warmed again instantly, but the passenger seat was not as it had been. Alex risked a glance. Where the ghost had been, the dark grey fabric of the seat was now marked by a patch of glistening dampness, a perfect human-shaped outline that steamed faintly in the ambient dashboard light. It was a cold residue, a phantom sweat of anguish left by a spirit forever, trying to get home. He knew then that Arthur Proudfoot was not trying to haunt the living. He was simply, eternally, trying to complete his final, interrupted journey. The M6's phantom was not a malevolent spirit, but a lost one, a man forever trapped in the moment his life was stolen, his ghostly presence a cold, damp scar on the road where he died. Some roads are haunted by rage, others by sorrow, but the A38, carving its way through the ancient monastic lands of Somerset, was haunted by faith. It was a different kind of fear that settled in Alex's bones as he left the motorways roar behind. Not the sharp terror of physical attack or the chilling grief of a lost soul, but a deep, reverent dread. The stories here spoke not of hitchhikers or phantom hands, but of a spectral monk, a cowled figure who wandered the lanes and laybys, his appearance often heralded by the sudden, inexplicable death of a car's engine. It was a haunting of silence and stillness, a divine interruption in the modern world's relentless noise. His first stop was Glastonbury. It tore a stark sentinel against the soft grey sky. But the answers he sought were not atop that mythic hill, but in the quiet ruins of a lesser-known abbey, a few miles from the A38 itself. The Abbey of St. Gregory was a place of fallen stones and whispered history, its grandeur reduced to skeletal arches that framed the passing clouds. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and old moss, and a profound quiet lay over the grounds, broken only by the call of crows. An elderly volunteer, a man named Mr. Albright with kind eyes and a librarian's stoop, became his guide through the ghost's history. Mr. Albright's account was not one of dramatic hauntings, but of quiet, persistent phenomena. He spoke of Brother Cuthbert, a lay brother from the 14th century known for his piety and his daily walks to a nearby village to tend to the sick. The path he trod was now buried beneath the modern tarmac of the A38. Over the years, dozens of motorists had reported seeing a brown-robed monk walking along the verge, his head bowed, his face hidden deep within his cowl. The encounters were brief, fleeting, but they shared two common chilling elements: a sudden, overwhelming feeling of a peaceful, yet watchful presence, and for those who stopped or stared too long, the abrupt stalling of their vehicle's engine. One driver, a local woman named Eleanor, had broken down on a dark, rainy night. As she waited for help, she saw the monk standing beneath a tree across the road, perfectly still. She described not fear, but an immense, calming stillness that settled over her, a sense of being protected. When the recovery vehicle arrived an hour later, her car started on the first turn of the key, the mechanic finding nothing wrong. Another account told of a group of teenagers whose car died as the monk passed by their window. They had felt a profound, shameful sense of being judged, of their loud music and raucous laughter being an affront to the sacred silence the figure carried with him. As Alex listened, walking with Mr. Albright through the ruined cloisters, the stories wove a tapestry not of malice but of guardianship. This was a ghost who enforced a kind of holy quiet, a reminder of the sanctity that had once blanketed this land. The monk was not causing accidents, he was causing pauses, moments of forced reflection in the headlong rush of modern life. Leaving the abbey as dusk began to pool in the hollows of the land, Alex felt the nature of his quest shift once more. He was not hunting a predator, but approaching a shrine. He drove onto the A38, the road now feeling like a profane scar across a consecrated landscape. He parked in a secluded lay-by that Mr. Albright had pointed out, a place where multiple sightings had occurred. He turned off the engine, and the silence rushed in. It was not an empty silence, but a heavy, waiting one. The twilight deepened, the trees along the road becoming solid black cutouts against the indigo sky, and as the last of the light faded, he felt it, not a cold, not a touch, but a presence, a feeling of being observed by something ancient and patient, something that had walked this path for centuries and would continue to walk it long after the asphalt had crumbled to dust. The ghostly monk was here, in the dark, his silent vigil a counterpoint to the fleeting lives that sped through his domain. The presence in the lay-by was a tangible weight, a silence so profound it seemed to swallow the very sound of Alex's own breathing. He sat in the driver's seat, the car a dark, cold island in the gathering dusk, and felt the ancient watchfulness of the monk as a pressure against his skin. It was not hostile, but it was immense, a patient, timeless attention that made the modern world of the car and the tarmac feel flimsy and transient. He had come seeking evidence, but now, immersed in the atmosphere, he felt more like a supplicant awaiting an audience. As the last sliver of sun vanished below the horizon, painting the western sky in bruised shades of violet and indigo, he knew he could not remain static. The ghost, according to all accounts, was a walker. He started the engine, the sound a vulgar intrusion in the holy quiet, and pulled back onto the A38. He drove slowly, his headlights cutting twin swathes through the deep twilight, illuminating the gnarled trunks of ancient oaks that lined the road. The world had reduced itself to this tunnel of light and the pressing darkness beyond. He saw the monk a half-mile later. The figure was just there, on the left-hand verge, materializing not from the shadows but from the very fabric of the place itself. He was tall and gaunt, shrouded in the coarse brown robes of his order, the cowl pulled so far forward that his face was an abyss of darkness. He walked with a slow, measured pace, his head bowed as if in perpetual prayer, his bare feet making no impression on the damp grass. He did not look up as Alex's car approached. He simply was, a fixed point in a moving world. Alex's foot instinctively lifted from the accelerator, the car coasting as he drew level. He expected the figure to fade, to vanish as the other apparitions had. But the monk did not. Instead, he turned. Without breaking his stride, the cowled head rotated toward the car, and from the depths of that shadow, Alex felt the full force of its gaze. It was not a look of malice, nor of curiosity, but of profound, unutterable sorrow and peace, a gaze that seemed to see straight through the metal and glass and into the core of his own weary, searching soul. Then, the monk stepped off the verge and into the road. He did not walk around the car. He walked through it. The bonnet of the car did not buckle, the windscreen did not shatter. The robed figure passed through the front of the vehicle as if it were mist, a brief, chilling darkness flowing through the engine block, through the dashboard, through Alex's own body in the driver's seat. For a split second, an arctic cold, far deeper than any he had felt before, locked his joints and stole his breath. It was the cold of stone crypts and forgotten centuries, carrying the scent of old incense, damp parchment, and dry earth. And in that fleeting, impossible moment of transgression, a sound filled the car, a low, resonant Gregorian chant, a single male voice singing a plainchant melody in a language long dead. The words were unclear, but the tone was one of eternal lament and devotion. As the ghostly form exited through the rear of the car, the engine gave a choked, gurgling sigh and died. All the dashboard lights winked out. The headlights faded to a dull orange glow and then to black. He was suddenly, utterly stranded, coasting to a silent halt in the middle of the dark lane, the steering wheel locked and lifeless in his hands. The chant ceased the moment the engine died. The crushing cold vanished, replaced by the normal chill of the night air. Alex sat in the profound silence, his heart hammering, his mind reeling from the violation of physics and the spiritual intensity of the encounter. He looked in the rearview mirror. The road behind was empty. The monk was gone, his passage marked only by the stalled car and the lingering, paradoxical emotions warring within Alex. A soul-deep sense of peace that felt like a blessing and a primal, human fear that trembled in his hands. He was alone on a dark road, touched by something holy and haunted, humbled and terrified in equal measure by the ghostly monk who walked through time and metal, enforcing his silent, sacred vigil upon the living. Some ghosts are born of sorrow, others of faith, but the spirit that haunted the A5 was forged in pure, undiluted rage. It was a fury that had outlasted centuries, a nobleman's wrath so potent it had stained the very land and tarmac he once owned. Alex felt the shift in atmosphere the moment he turned onto the old Roman road, now the A5, winding through the Welsh marches. This was not the mournful patience of the monk or the tragic repetition of the phantom hitchhiker. This was a predatory landscape. The trees seemed to lean in, their branches like grasping claws, and the rolling hills felt less like scenery and more like the burial mounds of old violent secrets. The air itself was heavy, thick with the promise of a storm and something far older, the lingering scent of damp leaf mold, cold stone and a metallic tang, like old blood. His research had led him to the market town of Kington, a place nestled in the shadow of Hurgist Ridge. The local library was a small, hushed building that smelled of polished wood and aging paper. Here, amidst leather-bound county histories and faded newspapers, he pieced together the legend of Thomas Vaughan, known to history and horror as Black Vaughan, a 15th-century nobleman, a man of immense power and temper, beheaded in a brutal skirmish during the War of the Roses. But death, it was said, had not quenched his fire. His spirit had refused to rest, terrorizing the locality with such violent hauntings, overturning carts, haunting bedrooms, causing livestock to die of fright, that the terrified populace had finally resorted to a ghost-laying ceremony of immense power. 12 priests had confronted his spectre, and, after a great spiritual struggle, managed to trap his raging soul within a snuff-box, which was then thrown into the deepest part of a nearby lake, Hurgist Croft Pond. Yet the containment had not been permanent. Folklore whispered that the box had long since corroded, its spiritual locks broken. Black Vaughan was free again, and his old rage had found a new playground, the modern A5, the road that now sliced through his ancestral lands. The reports were stark and terrifying. Drivers spoke of a towering, dark figure on horseback that would materialize in the middle of the road, causing them to swerve violently. Others told of an oppressive presence in their car, of lights flickering and dying, of a deep, guttural voice whispering threats from the back seat. This was not a ghost that asked for a ride or enforced peace. This was a ghost that caused accidents, that reveled in chaos and fear, a lord of the land still asserting his terrible dominion. Alex closed the last of the heavy books, the printed words painting a vivid picture of a cruel, powerful man whose pride had curdled into an eternal malignancy. Leaving the library, the afternoon sun seemed weak, its light unable to penetrate the deep, primal shadow the story had cast over his mind. He drove out of Kington, following the A5 as it curved around the base of Hurgist Ridge. He parked at a viewpoint overlooking the patchwork fields and the distant dark gleam of Hurgist Croft Pond, the site of Vaughan's imprisonment. The water looked black and deep, a perfect hiding place for a caged demon. As he stood there, the sun dipped behind a bank of thick, bruise-colored clouds, plunging the landscape into a premature twilight. A wind picked up, whipping through the dry grass, carrying a sudden, biting chill. It was then that the feeling of being watched returned, more intense than ever before. It was not the calm observation of the monk, but a predatory scrutiny. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He scanned the ridge, the fields, the road. Below, nothing moved but the wind-tossed branches. He got back into his car, the sense of unease a cold stone in his gut. Starting the engine, he pulled back onto the A5, driving slowly, his eyes constantly moving. The road was empty, the gathering gloom making the world monochrome, and then he saw them. Shadows. Not the long, stretching shadows of the setting sun, but smaller, quicker things. Dark shapes, no larger than dogs, that darted across the road just at the edge of his headlights' reach. They moved with impossible speed, flowing from one hedgerow to another, their forms indistinct but undeniably alive with malevolent intent. They were not animals. They felt like extensions of a single, watching consciousness, scouts for the main force of the haunting. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, his heart beginning to pound a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He was on Black Vaughan's land now, and the lord of the manor had sent out his hounds. The exploration was over. The hunt had begun. The darting shadows were not a warning, they were a herald. They flanked Alex's car, swift and fluid as spilled ink, keeping pace just beyond the reach of his trembling headlights. The air inside the vehicle grew thick and heavy, tainted with the scent of ozone and damp soil, the very atmosphere curdling with a rising malice. He pressed the accelerator, the engine whining in protest, as he pushed the car faster along the winding A5, desperate to outrun the feeling of being corralled, of being driven towards some unseen, waiting trap. The ancient trees lining the road seemed to close in, their branches forming a gnarled, skeletal tunnel from which there was no escape. Ahead, where the road dipped into a shallow valley, the headlights faltered. They didn't dim, they stuttered, flickering wildly between full beam and a sickly, jaundiced yellow, casting a frantic, strobing light that made the world jump and lurch. In one of those stark, frozen flashes of illumination, the apparition appeared. It was not a gradual materialization, but a sudden, brutal imposition on reality. A man, towering and broad-shouldered, sat astride a massive spectral warhorse in the very center of the lane. He was clad in the dark, ornate plate armor of a 15th-century nobleman, but the helmet was gone. Where his head should have been was a ragged, bloody stump, from which a faint phosphorescent glow emanated. In the crook of his arm, held with casual, ghastly familiarity, was his own head. The face was contorted in a silent, eternal scream of pure, undiluted fury, the eyes burning with a cold blue fire that seemed to sear the very air. Black Vaughan. The name echoed in Alex's mind, a scream of recognition. The head, clutched in the ghost's arm, turned. Those blazing eyes locked onto Alex's through the windscreen. There was no soul behind them, no trace of the man Thomas Vaughan had once been, only a bottomless, centuries-old rage that had festered into a cosmic hatred for the living who trespassed on his land. Alex slammed his foot on the brake, the tires shrieking in protest, the car slewing sideways in a cloud of burning rubber and steam. He fought the wheel, his own scream trapped in his throat, expecting the sickening impact. But there was none. The spectral horse and rider did not move. They were an immovable object, a focal point of nightmare around which the car spun. As the vehicle shuddered to a halt, skewed across both lanes, the interior was plunged into near darkness, the flickering headlights finally dying completely. The dashboard lights sputtered and went out. The engine gave one last, choked gasp and fell silent. In the profound, suffocating blackness that followed, a voice filled the car. It did not come from the outside, nor from the speakers. It seemed to form in the space between the molecules of air, a guttural, grinding whisper that vibrated in Alex's bones and crawled inside his skull. "Mine," it rasped, the sound of stone grinding on stone. "This land is mine. Your blood will salt my earth. Your fear is my tribute." The words were not English, not any language he knew, and yet their meaning was seared into his consciousness with perfect, horrifying clarity. It was the voice of the earth itself claiming him. Panic, pure and undiluted, exploded through him. It overrode thought, overriding terror itself. His body moved on an instinct older than reason. He twisted the key in the ignition. The starter motor whined uselessly, a pathetic counterpoint to the phantom's ancient threat. He tried again, his hand shaking violently. On the third attempt, the engine coughed, caught, and roared to life. The headlights blazed back on, illuminating the empty road. The apparition was gone, the oppressive presence lifted, the crushing weight in the air dissipating as if it had never been. He didn't think. He shoved the gear stick into drive and stamped on the accelerator, the car lurching forward, tires scrabbling for grip. He drove, hunched over the wheel, his breath coming in ragged, painful sobs, not slowing until the lights of the next town glimmered in the distance, a promise of sanctuary and the mundane world. He finally understood. This was not a ghost seeking peace or justice. This was the lingering rage of a tyrant, a man betrayed and beheaded, his spirit forever bound to the land he once ruled, eternally punishing any who dared to pass through his domain. Black Vaughan did not haunt the A5, he owned it, and his fury was the toll every traveller unknowingly risked. The ghosts of modern roads spoke of personal tragedy, of love and loss measured in decades, but the A66, carving its ancient path through the wild, brooding landscape of Cumbria, whispered of a far older sorrow, one measured in centuries. Here, the hauntings were not of cars and hitchhikers, but of empire and iron. The legend was not of a phantom vehicle, but of a phantom legionary, a lone Roman soldier eternally marching a forgotten patrol along the old Roman road that now lay buried beneath the modern tarmac. It was a story of duty so absolute it had outlasted the empire that had commanded it, a ghost not of a man, but of an idea. Alex felt the weight of that history the moment he left the M6 and joined the A66. heading east towards the Pennines. The landscape was vast and muscular, a dramatic theatre of rolling fells and stark, flat-topped hills that seemed to swallow the sky. The road itself was a stark grey ribbon laid across this epic canvas, but its straight, purposeful lines betrayed its Roman ancestry. This was not a road that meandered. It was a road that conquered, a testament to an empire's will to impose order upon the wilderness. And somewhere along its length, one of its soldiers was still on duty. His first stop was a small, stone-built pub in the village of Temple Sowerby, a place whose low ceilings and smoky atmosphere felt as ancient as the hills outside. The locals, farmers, and tradesmen with faces weathered by the Cumbrian wind spoke of the soldier not with fear, but with a kind of resigned familiarity, as one might speak of a stubborn weather pattern. Their stories were all variations on a theme. A driver, usually at night or in bad weather, would see a figure in the beam of their headlights. A man in armor, carrying a spear or a shield, marching with a steady, relentless pace along the grassy verge. He never looked at the cars, never acknowledged their blinding lights or roaring engines. He simply marched, his gaze fixed on some distant, invisible point, a sentinel on a border that had vanished 1,500 years ago. One old farmer, sipping a pint of bitter by the fire, described seeing him during a blizzard, a dark, solid shape trudging through the swirling white, the crest on his helmet dusted with snow. Another, a lorry driver, told of the soldier appearing suddenly in his high beams on a foggy autumn night, causing him to swerve, the ghostly form passing through the front of his cab with a brief, shocking chill before vanishing into the mist behind him. The accounts were consistent, stark, and utterly compelling. This was not an interactive spirit, it was an echo, a recording on a loop, a man forever performing the duty for which he had likely lived and died. Alex left the pub as the sky began to threaten rain, the clouds massing over the fells like an army of their own. He drove the A66 as dusk began to settle, the long shadows of the hills stretching across the road like grasping fingers. He passed the remnants of a Roman fort, a few low, grassy mounds barely visible from the road, a silent testament to the reality behind the legend. The rain began as a fine mist, then strengthened into a steady, drenching downpour that hammered on the roof of the car and turned the road into a slick, black mirror. The wipers beat a frantic rhythm, and the world outside dissolved into a grey, watery blur. It was in the heart of this storm, on a long, lonely stretch flanked by nothing but open moorland, that he saw it. A faint, shimmering outline in the periphery of his headlights, on the left-hand verge. He slowed, squinting through the rain-streaked windscreen. The figure was barely more than a distortion in the downpour, a human-shaped patch of thicker mist that held its form against the wind. But as his headlights fully caught it, the details snapped into fleeting, impossible focus. The glint of metal on a segmented lorica, the curve of a helmet, the straight line of a pylon held upright. The soldier was there, marching into the teeth of the storm, his form translucent, the rain seeming to fall through him. He took 2 more phantom steps on the sodden grass, his movement steady and purposeful, and then the image dissolved, fading back into the sheeting rain as if it had never been. The encounter lasted less than 3 seconds, a brief, silent vision of a ghost from a lost world, a testament to a duty that death itself could not end. The Phantom. Legionary's brief, rain-shrouded appearance was a ghostly postcard from a lost world, an echo that left Alex's mind reeling with the sheer, impossible weight of time. He drove on through the storm, the rhythmic thump of the wipers a monotonous counterpoint to the chaotic thunder of his thoughts. This was not a ghost of personal tragedy, this was history itself, walking. The soldier's duty had outlived his empire, his language, his very gods. It was a haunting of a different magnitude, one that made the modern world feel like a fleeting, insignificant scrim, laid over something far older and more permanent. He spent the night in a small guest house near Bowes, the storm finally abating to a persistent drizzle. The following morning dawned grey and washed clean, the air sharp with the scent of wet earth and peat. The encounter had been too brief, too ethereal. He needed more. He needed to understand the anchor that held this ancient spirit to this specific stretch of road. He visited the modest local museum, a room filled with glass cases displaying the detritus of the Roman occupation found in nearby fields, corroded coins, broken pottery, a single rusted iron hobnail from a Caligay sandal. The curator, an elderly woman with a passion for local history, confirmed what he had suspected. The A66 followed the course of the Roman road known as Dare Street, a vital military supply route linking the legionary fortress at York to the Wall and the wild north. Patrols would have been constant, a thin, iron line of empire holding back the chaos of the untamed Brigantian tribes. They weren't just soldiers, she said, her voice soft. They were men, far from home. Some settled, some died. Their ghosts are the ghosts of loneliness as much as duty. She told him of local folklore that spoke of a specific soldier, a young recruit from Italia who had drowned crossing a river in full armor during a sudden flood. His body was never recovered, and his spirit, it was said, was condemned to forever walk his post, searching for his comrades and a way back to a home he would never see again. That story of a specific, lonely death settled over Alex as he returned to the A66 that evening. The sky was clear now, a vast, star-dusted blackness arching over the blacker silhouettes of the fells. He drove slowly, the road almost deserted, his headlights painting the tarmac a sterile white. He was looking for the stretch where the old road would have crossed a stream, now channeled through a culvert beneath the modern highway. He felt a strange sense of anticipation, not of fear but of solemnity. He was not chasing a predator but approaching a monument. He saw the glint of water in his headlights, a small bridge ahead, and as he approached it, the Roman soldier stepped out of the darkness. He did not shimmer into existence on the verge. He materialized directly in the center of the lane, 20 yards ahead, as solid and immediate as a living man. The transition from nothingness to full, terrifying presence was instantaneous. The helmet, the segmented armor, the heavy shield on his arm, the spear held upright. Every detail was stark and clear in the blinding glare of the headlights. His face was young, pale, and set in an expression of grim determination, his eyes looking straight through the car, focused on a horizon 2,000 years gone. Alex's foot slammed onto the brake pedal with a jolt of pure reflexive terror. The car's anti-lock braking system shuddered violently, the tires screeching a high-pitched protest that tore through the silent night. He was thrown forward against his seatbelt, the force of the deceleration pressing him into the webbing. The bonnet dipped, the headlights illuminating the ghostly form that stood, immovable, in the path of certain collision. But there was no impact. In the split second before the car would have struck him, the soldier simply vanished. He did not fade or dissolve. He was there, and then he was. Not winked out of existence like a snuffed candle. The space he had occupied was suddenly, jarringly empty. Alex's car shuddered to a complete stop, the front bumper a mere foot from the spot where the legionary had stood. The only sound was the frantic, ragged gasp of his own breathing and the frantic ticking of the cooling engine. He sat there for a long moment, his hands welded to the steering wheel, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The road was empty. The night was silent. The encounter had been so brief, so violent in its suddenness, and yet it left behind a profound, echoing silence. Slowly, his limbs trembling with the aftershock of adrenaline, he put the car in park and stepped out into the cold night air. He walked to the front of the car, half expecting to see some mark, some scorch on the tarmac. There was nothing. He leaned against the warm bonnet, trying to steady himself, and looked back into the car. His digital recorder, his notebook, his map were scattered on the passenger seat. And there, nestled in the crease between the seat and the backrest, was a small, dull gleam. Frowning, he opened the passenger door and reached in. His fingers closed around two small, cold, metallic discs. He held them up in the dim interior light. They were coins. Crude, heavy replicas, stamped not with the Queen's head, but with the profiled bust of an emperor, Hadrian perhaps, or Trajan. On the reverse was an eagle, its wings spread. They were cold to the touch, not with the chill of the night, but with the deep, subterranean cold of something that had lain in the earth for centuries. They had not been there when he left the guest house. They were a token, a solid, tangible piece of the impossible left behind by a ghost from a lost empire. They were a link, not just to a local history, but to the lonely, eternal vigil of a boy from Italia, forever marching a road that was no longer his, paying for his passage into legend with phantom coin. Some roads are haunted by what you see, others by what you feel, but the B1225, a narrow winding lane cutting through the flat open wolds of Lincolnshire, was haunted by a sound. It was a sound that bypassed the eyes and the skin to lodge directly in the primal fear centers of the brain, a scream. Not a human scream of terror or pain, but something far older and more chilling. The legendary piercing wail of a disembodied skull, a sound said to erupt from the very ditches and hedgerows, a sonic ghost that could shatter concentration and lure drivers toward disaster. After the visual horrors of Black Vaughan and the stoic presence of the Roman soldier, this auditory haunting felt like a new, more insidious layer of the supernatural, an attack on the senses that offered nothing to see, only to hear and to dread. The landscape itself seemed designed for such a phantom. The B1225 was a road of long, lonely straights and sudden, sharp bends hemmed in by high, unkempt hedgerows that blocked any long-range view. The fields beyond were vast and empty, their monotony broken only by the occasional skeletal tree or a distant, lonely farmhouse. The sky was a wide, pale bowl, making the world feel exposed and yet claustrophobically enclosed by the green walls of the lane. It was a place where sound could travel for miles or be swallowed completely in the space between two heartbeats. Alex's first port of call was a village garage, a place that smelled of oil and petrol, where the local mechanic, a stout, no-nonsense man in his 50s named Bill, became an unlikely chronicler of the paranormal. Over a mug of strong, sweet tea, Bill's story unfolded with the reluctant cadence of a man recounting something he desperately wished he could forget. It had happened 2 winters ago, on a night of freezing fog. He'd been driving home on the B1225, his van crawling along, the fog so thick it felt like wool. Then the sound came. It started as a distant, high-pitched keen, like the wind, whistling through a cracked fence post, but it quickly swelled into a full-throated, agonized scream, a raw, grating shriek that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, from the fog itself. It was a sound of pure, mindless agony, devoid of any humanity, the scream of something that had forgotten it had lungs. The sound was so shocking, so physically painful to his ears, that Bill had instinctively wrenched the steering wheel, his hands flying from the shock of it. The van had veered violently, its front tire mounting the grassy verge and sending it into a sickening skid toward a stout oak tree. Only a last-second, desperate correction, born of years of driving instinct, had saved him, the van sliding to a halt with its bumper inches from the trunk. The scream had cut off the moment he regained control. The silence that followed, as absolute as the scream, had been deafening. He'd sat there, trembling, for 10 minutes, the echo of that unearthly wail still ringing in his skull. He'd found nothing in the ditch, no animal, no source, just the fog, the dark, and the memory of the sound. Leaving the garage, Alex felt a new kind of apprehension. A ghost you could see was a problem you could face. A ghost that was only a sound was a predator that remained forever in the shadows. He drove onto the B1225 as the afternoon light began to fail, the long shadows of the hedgerows stretching across the lane like grasping fingers. He drove slowly, his windows partially down, the digital recorder on the passenger seat set to its most sensitive mode. The normal sounds of the countryside filled the car, the whisper of the wind through the hawthorn, the distant bleat of a sheep, the hum of his own tires. He listened intently, straining for anything that fell outside that spectrum. For an hour, there was nothing, just the quiet, lonely road. Dusk deepened into a soft purple twilight, and a thin, ground-hugging mist began to form in the low-lying fields, seeping through the hedges to coil across the tarmac like smoke. It was then that he heard it. Faint at first, so faint he thought it might be a trick of the wind or a distant piece of farm machinery. A long, drawn-out wail, high and thin, like a blade being dragged over glass. It seemed to come from far ahead, somewhere beyond the next bend. He slowed the car to a crawl, his heart beginning to thud a slow, heavy rhythm. He stopped the car entirely, killing the engine. The silence was profound. He held his breath, listening, and there it was again, closer this time. A distant echoing wail that rippled through the misty air, a sound of such desolate ancient sorrow that it made the fine hairs on his arms stand erect. It was not a human sound, nor that of any animal he could name. It was the sound the B-12225's legend promised, the screaming skull. It was out there, in the gathering dark and the rising mist, and it had just announced its presence. The distant wail coiled through the misty twilight, a sound so desolate it seemed to leach the warmth from the very air inside the car. Alex sat frozen, his hands tight on the steering wheel, every sense focused on that terrible echoing cry. It was not a sound of this world, not the shriek of a fox or the groan of straining metal. It was a vocalization of pure, spectral agony, the scream of something that should not have a voice. The stories from the garage, Bill's pale, shaken face, they all crystallized into a cold, hard knot of dread in his stomach. He was not just listening to a legend, he was its intended audience. He started the engine, the sound of vulgar intrusion, and crept the car forward, following the winding lane toward the source of the scream. The mist thickened, swallowing the world beyond the hedgerows, reducing his universe to a tunnel of grey-green foliage and slick, dark tarmac. The wail came again, closer now, no longer an echo but a direct assault. It seemed to emanate from the ditch on his left, a grating, piercing shriek that vibrated through the car's chassis and drilled directly into his skull. It was a sound that bypassed the ears and resonated in the teeth, a high-frequency torment designed to shatter nerve and sanity. Then it moved. It was no longer in the ditch. The scream seemed to leap through the air, passing through the metal of the car door as if it weren't there, and suddenly it was inside the vehicle with him. The sound erupted from the empty footwell of the passenger seat, a deafening, full-volume blast of phantom anguish. It was no longer distant or echoing, but immediate and intimate, a scream happening right beside him. The force of it was physical, a pressure wave that made his ears pop and his vision blur. The steering wheel vibrated in his grip. The sound was all-consuming, a cyclone of noise that wiped out all other thought, all other sense. It was the scream of the skull, and it was in his car, disoriented, nauseated. His head ringing with the phantom vibration, Alex fought to keep the car on the road. The lane swam in his tear-filled eyes. He stomped on the brake, the tires skidding on the damp surface, and wrestled the shuddering vehicle onto a wide patch of grass verge. He killed the engine, and as he did, the screaming ceased. The silence that rushed in was as shocking and absolute as the noise had been, a void that felt heavy and expectant. He sat panting, his hands trembling uncontrollably, the echo of the scream still a physical pain deep within his ears. He turned his head, his heart hammering against his ribs, and looked out the passenger side window. The glass was fogged from his own breath and the damp air outside. And there, pressed against the misted pane from the outside, was a face. It was not a skull, but the ghost of a face. A man's, middle-aged, with features blurred and indistinct as if seen through troubled water. The expression was one of silent, desperate pleading, the eyes wide with a sorrow so profound it seemed to suck the light from the air. It was a visage of tragedy, not malice. It hovered for a moment, a pale smudge against the darkening grey of the mist, and then it faded, dissolving until only the condensation on the glass remained. Shaken to his core, Alex stumbled from the car, the cold night air a slap against his feverish skin. He leaned against the bonnet, his legs weak, and stared into the empty field from which the face had come. The encounter had been brief, but its message was seared into him. This was not a random haunting. This was a spirit with a purpose. Later, in a village pub, his hands still unsteady around a pint of ale, he found the rest of the story from a grizzled local historian. The field by that bend was once the site of a lonely cottage. A century ago, a wealthy farmer was murdered there by his jealous brother for his land and fortune. The killer had buried the body, but the victim's skull, it was said, had been hidden separately, never found. The screams were not of mindless agony, but of a spirit crying out for justice, using the only weapon it had left, its voice, to disrupt the peace of the road built over its grave, a perpetual sonic demand for its bones to be found and laid to rest. The screaming skull was not a monster, it was a witness, and its endless wail was a testament to a murder that had never been solved. Some roads are haunted by echoes of individual sorrow, but the A3, carving its way through the deep ancient woodlands of Surrey and Hampshire, was haunted by an entire spectacle of the past, a grand rolling tragedy. The legend was not of a single ghost, but of a phantom entourage, a spectral coach, black and ornate, drawn by a team of 4 powerful horses, thundering down the old coaching route with a fury that defied the silence of the grave. And the most chilling detail, the one that separated it from mere folklore and elevated it to nightmare, was the horses. They were all headless. It was a vision of Gothic horror playing out on modern tarmac, a ghost train from a bygone era of travel and terror. The transition from the auditory horror of the B1225 to this new visceral legend was jarring. Alex left the flat, open wolds behind and drove into the embrace of the Surrey woodlands. The A3 here was a faster, broader road, but sections of it still followed the winding path of the old Portsmouth Road, tunneled through dense stands of oak and beech that cast the asphalt into a perpetual, dappled twilight. The air felt different here, older, heavier with the scent of damp leaf litter and decaying wood. It was a landscape that remembered coaches and highwaymen, a perfect stage for a haunting of such flamboyant, macabre grandeur. His research led him to a charming, ivy-clad cottage just outside the village of Thursley, home to an elderly couple, Eleanor and George Wainwright. They were in their late 80s, their faces a roadmap of a long and gentle life, but their eyes held a shared, unshakable memory that had marked them. Over tea and ginger biscuits in a cozy sitting room filled with the ticking of a grandfather clock, they told their story. It had been a crisp, moonlit night some 20 years earlier. They were returning from visiting their daughter, driving their old Morris Minor along a quiet, tree-lined stretch of the A3. "It was the sound we heard first," Eleanor began, her voice soft but clear. "Not the sound of a modern car. A rolling, rhythmic thunder, like barrels being dragged over cobbles, and a jingling, like many tiny bells." George nodded, taking up the tale. "I saw it in the rearview mirror, coming up behind us at a terrific pace, a great black coach, like something from a museum, but alive. And the horses—" He paused, his hand trembling slightly as he lifted his teacup. They were huge, powerful beasts, dark as midnight, and where their heads should have been, there was nothing. Just nothing. And yet they ran, pulling that coach as if the devil himself were driving. The coach had raced up, behind their slow-moving car, its phantom bulk seeming to fill the entire road. For a heart-stopping moment, it drew level, the ornate gilded details on its black doors clear in the moonlight. The windows were dark, revealing no passenger within. Then, with a blast of air that was both icy cold and smelled of old leather, dust and oiled metal, the entire apparition swept past them and through a solid brick wall bordering the road, vanishing without a trace. They had pulled over, shaken but unharmed, their old car filled with the lingering, strange odor of the phantom, for hours afterward. Their account, delivered with the quiet conviction of absolute truth, painted a vivid, terrifying picture. This was not a subtle haunting. It was a full-scale invasion from the past, a moment where time folded and a relic of a more brutal age imposed itself upon the present. Leaving their cottage, the warm, sunlit garden felt like a fragile illusion. The real world, Alex was beginning to understand, was far thinner and more porous than he had ever imagined. That night, he returned to the A3, parking in a secluded lay-by near the stretch the Wainwrights had described. The moon was a sharp sliver of bone in a clear, cold sky, and the woods were a wall of impenetrable blackness on either side of the road. The modern traffic was a distant hum, leaving him in a pocket of near silence. He sat in the dark, the recorder on, the camera with its night vision mode at the ready. He waited, listening to the normal sounds of the night. An owl, the rustle of some small creature in the undergrowth, the sigh of the wind in the high branches. Then he heard it. Faint at first, a vibration more than a sound, coming up through the chassis of the car. A rhythmic, pounding beat. It grew steadily louder, resolving into the unmistakable, thunderous rhythm of galloping hooves. Not the light clip-clop of a single horse, but the heavy, coordinated drumming of a team, a powerful polyrhythmic tattoo that shook the very ground. It sounded as if it were just around the next bend, coming toward him at a ferocious, impossible speed. He strained his eyes, peering into the darkness, expecting at any moment to see the headless team and the black coach erupt from the shadows. But the sound reached a deafening crescendo right beside his car, a rolling wave of phantom hoofbeats that vibrated through his seat and rattled the windows. And then it began to recede, fading with the same steady rhythm into the distance ahead, leaving behind nothing but a profound, ringing silence and the cold, certain knowledge that the ghostly coach was real, and it was running its timeless route, whether anyone was there to see it or not. The phantom hoofbeats faded into the night, leaving a silence that felt deeper and more profound than any Alex had ever known. It was a void carved out by the passing of something immense and impossible. The air in the car remained still, but the memory of that thunderous vibration lingered in his bones, a phantom resonance that made the solid metal of the vehicle feel as insubstantial as tissue paper. He had heard it. The headless team, the spectral coach, they were not just a story told by a gentle old couple in a sunlit room. They were a force, an event that happened, and he had been a witness to its sound, if not yet its sight. He sat for a long time in the dark lay-by, the recorder's red light a single unblinking eye, documenting the empty silence that was, in its own way, more terrifying than the noise had been. He knew he could not leave. The encounter was incomplete. The Wainwrights had seen it, he had only heard its approach and its departure. He needed to see. He started the engine, the sound jarringly mundane, and pulled back onto the A3. He drove slowly, his senses stretched to their limits, his eyes scanning the dark tunnel of the road ahead. The moon provided just enough silvery light to etch the edges of the trees and the curve of the tarmac in. Monochrome. He was chasing a ghost, but it felt more like waiting for a tidal wave, a predetermined cataclysm that would occur with or without him. It began as a distortion in the darkness ahead, a patch of deeper black that refused to resolve into the shape of a tree or a bend in the road. It grew rapidly, swelling in size and definition with an unnerving speed that defied perspective. One moment it was a smudge, the next it was a full-blown apparition charging directly toward him, the ghostly coach. It was larger and more terrifying than any description could convey. A massive, black enclosed carriage, its body ornate with gilded scrollwork that gleamed with a sickly, phosphorescent light in the moonlight. It rode high on great spoked wheels, but they made no sound as they spun, a silent film of horror projected onto the real world. And before it, the 4 horses. They were monstrous in their power and their mutilation, their muscular necks terminating in ragged, bloody stumps. Yet they ran with a coordinated, furious energy, their phantom hooves now striking the modern asphalt in absolute silence, a pantomime of sound he had heard just minutes before. There was no time to think, no time to brake or swerve. The coach was upon him in a heartbeat, a rolling avalanche of black lacquer and silent fury, filling his entire field of vision. It did not swerve to avoid him. It did not attempt to pass. It came straight on, a juggernaut from another century, and then it did the impossible. It passed through his car. There was no impact, no shattering of glass or screaming of tortured metal. The black bulk of the coach flowed into the front of his vehicle like a wave of dark water, the ornate details of its side sweeping through his dashboard, through his own chest, through the seats. A torrent of sensations flooded him, a rush of wind that was frigid and carried the sense of old, mildewed velvet, polished mahogany, and the sharp, coppery tang of blood. For a single, elongated second, He was inside the coach, surrounded by its ghostly interior, a passenger in its nightmare journey. Then it was gone, flowing out through the rear of the car and continuing its silent, headlong charge down the A3, shrinking back into the darkness from which it had come. Alex gasped, his hands clenching the steering wheel as if it were a lifeline. The car was filled with the aftershock of the phantom wind, a turbulent, icy eddy that whipped his hair and rustled the papers on the passenger seat. It was real. It had happened. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, living counterpoint to the silent dead that had just violated his space. With trembling, automatic movements, he fumbled for the camera on the seat beside him. He raised it, his fingers clumsy, and pointed it through the windscreen at the empty road where the coach had vanished. He clicked the shutter several times, the flash illuminating the empty tarmac in stark, brief bursts. He didn't need to look at the screen to know what he would find. Later, parked under the sterile lights of a 24-hour service station, he would scroll through the images. They would be blurry, streaked with phantom light and unexplained shadows, the colors distorted. In one, a smoky, indistinct shape that might be a wheel. In another, a smear of darkness that could be a horse's flank. They were useless as evidence, perfect as a personal testament to the impossible. But in that moment, sitting in the car as the last of the phantom wind sighed into nothingness, he knew. He knew the story. His frantic late-night research after leaving the Wainwrights had uncovered it. The coach was tied to the death of a notorious 18th-century nobleman, a man of immense wealth and cruel habits, who had been decapitated in a gruesome coaching accident on this very stretch of road, when his terrified horses had bolted, crashing the vehicle and scattering the heads of the team and their master across the dark woods. His ghost, and the ghosts of his means of transport, were condemned to reenact that final, furious, headless ride for eternity, a rolling monument to a death of spectacular violence, forever charging down a road that had long forgotten the man, but not his terrible, enduring end. The M62 was a beast of a different nature. It was not a road haunted by a single tragic soul, but by a collective, a shifting, amorphous haunting that belonged to the weather itself. The stories spoke not of one ghost, but of many, shadowy humanoid forms that coalesced within the motorway's infamous bone-white fogs, figures that darted between the lanes, causing panicked swerves and near misses. They were the fog figures, phantoms of the Pennines, and their domain was the highest motorway in England, a place where the weather didn't just change the mood, it became the monster. After the visceral, historical horrors of the A5 and the A3, this felt more primal, more elemental. Alex drove east from Manchester, the urban sprawl gradually giving way to the dramatic, rolling backs of the Pennine Hills. The sky was a flat, leaden grey, promising the very conditions he sought. He stopped at a service station high on the moorland stretch, a place frequented by truckers who knew this road's fickle, often deadly, personality. The air in the cafe was thick with the smell of diesel and fried food, and the conversations were punctuated by wary glances out the large windows at the descending mist. He found his sources easily enough. The legend was common currency here. A lorry driver named Frank, his face etched with the fatigue of 100 nighttime crossings, spoke in a low, gravelly rumble. He described seeing them 2 winters ago, in a fog so thick his headlights were useless. Dark, slender shapes, like men made of smoke, weaving through the stalled traffic. They had no faces, no features, just a human silhouette that seemed to drink the light. One had passed straight through the grill of his truck, a brief, shocking coldness that had iced his windscreen from the inside. Another driver, a younger woman named Chloe, spoke of a figure that had appeared directly in front of her car, causing her to wrench the wheel and clip the central reservation. When she'd looked back, the fog was empty, the phantom gone as if it had never been. The consensus was grim and unanimous. The fog figures were not benign. They were hazards, as real and dangerous as black ice, phantoms that used the weather as both cloak and weapon. Leaving the service station, Alex felt the first tendrils of mist curling over the high moor, caressing the tarmac with ghostly fingers. He joined the motorway, the traffic a steady rumbling flow. But as he climbed higher, the world began to change. The mist thickened from a haze to a milky soup, reducing visibility to a few car lengths. The sounds of the motorway became muffled, distorted. The roar of a lorry would approach from nowhere, and then fade just as quickly, its origin and destination lost in the swirling grey. His world shrank to the red taillights of the car in front, and the faint glowing path of his own headlights, which now reflected back at him, creating a disorienting luminous cage. He drove on, his speed dropping, his senses hyper-alert. The fog was alive, shifting and pulsing with a life of its own, and within those pulses he began to see them. At first, they were just deeper shadows in the grey, fleeting impressions in the periphery of his vision. A tall, dark shape standing motionless on the hard shoulder, gone when he turned his head. A shorter, stooped figure scurrying across the lane ahead, swallowed by the fog before he could brake. They were silhouettes, cutouts of absolute blackness against the lesser grey of the fog, human in form but utterly devoid of detail. They made no sound, offered no gesture. They simply were, appearing and disappearing with the random, terrifying logic of a dream. One materialized much closer, just to the left of his bonnet. It was the clearest yet, a tall, slender outline, featureless and stark, standing between the lanes as if waiting for a gap in the phantom traffic of its own world. For a heart-stopping second, it seemed to turn its blank head toward him. There was no face, no eyes, but he felt the weight of its attention, a cold, impersonal scrutiny from the heart of the fog. Then, a gust of wind, or perhaps the wake of a passing lorry he couldn't see, swirled the mist, and the figure dissolved, its form pulled apart into strands of darkness that were swallowed by the white. Alex's hands were slick with sweat on the wheel. He was no longer just driving in fog, he was driving through a crowd, a silent, shifting congregation of lost souls who had made the perpetual mist of the M62 their eternal wandering home. The fog was no longer just weather, it was a solid, suffocating presence, a white wall that absorbed sound and light and hope. The fleeting silhouettes Alex had glimpsed were no longer phantoms at the edge of vision. They were here. They solidified from the swirling grey one by one, until a loose circle of them surrounded his slowing car. They stood between the lanes and on the hard shoulder, tall, slender, and utterly black, like human-shaped voids punched through the fabric of the world. They had no faces, no clothing, no features of any kind, just a profound, light-devouring darkness that was more terrifying than any grotesque visage. They were absence-given form, and they had him trapped. His car, a tiny, fragile island of warmth and life, was the focus of their silent, collective attention. He felt the weight of their gaze, a cold, impersonal pressure from a dozen blank spaces where faces should have been. He brought the vehicle to a complete stop, the engine idling roughly, the wipers beating a frantic, useless rhythm against the impenetrable fog on the windscreen. He was paralyzed, caught between the instinct to flee and the terrifying knowledge that there was nowhere to go. Then the tapping began. It started on the passenger side window, a soft, almost polite tap, 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 like a branch brushing the glass. But there were no branches on the M62. A moment later, a similar sound came from the rear window on the driver's side. Then the bonnet. Then the roof. The taps were not synchronized, they were a random percussive chorus of contact, a gentle, insistent knocking from every direction. Tap, 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 tap. The sound was dry, brittle, like bone on glass. He stared, horrified, at the window beside him. One of the figures was standing there, so close its form blotted out the fog. A long, slender, pitch-black arm rose, and a fingerless, indistinct extremity tapped once more against the pane. Tap. It was not an attempt to break in. It was a notification, an announcement of their presence. They were letting him know he was not alone, that his metal shell was no protection against their reality. Panic, cold and sharp, finally overrode his paralysis. This was not a haunting to be studied or understood. It was a swarm, an infestation of the road itself. He couldn't stay here, a sitting target in this luminous coffin. His foot slammed down on the accelerator. The engine roared, a violent, living sound in the dead, muffled world. The tires screeched, fighting for traction on the damp asphalt. He didn't aim for a gap. He aimed straight for the figure directly in front of the bonnet. The car surged forward. He braced for an impact that never came. The dark form seemed to ripple as the grille made contact, its substance offering no more resistance than smoke. It dissolved around the front of the car, streaming past the windows in tendrils of black mist that were swallowed by the fog behind him. A wave of intense cold washed through the interior, so brief it was like plunging into an icy river and bursting out the other side. He kept his foot down, the speedometer climbing, the red tail lights of the car he'd been following. Long since vanished. He drove blind, trusting the lane markings he could barely see, weaving through a ghostly gauntlet that parted before him like a dark sea. Figures dissolved to his left and right, their forms unraveling into the fog from which they'd been woven, their silent tapping replaced by the frantic thump of his own heart and the roar of the escaping engine. After what felt like an eternity, but could only have been a minute, the fog began to thin. The oppressive whiteness retreated, the world expanding once more. He saw the tail lights of other vehicles ahead, the reassuring glow of a distant gantry. He slowed, his body trembling violently, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The M62 was just a motorway again, cars passing him with mundane indifference. He pulled into the next services, his hands shaking so badly he could barely turn off the ignition. In the sudden, stark silence of the parking lot, under the orange glow of the sodium lights, the question formed in his mind, cold and clear. Were they malevolent spirits, deliberately causing accidents, or were they something else, something sadder, lost souls perhaps, the echoes of those who had died in the countless crashes that plagued this high, treacherous motorway? Were they not attacking but simply present, trapped in the conditions of their death, forever wandering the fog-bound limbo of the road, their tapping not a threat but a futile attempt to connect, to be seen, to hitch a ride out of their eternal mist-shrouded purgatory? He had no answers, only the chilling memory of their silent black forms and the brittle sound of their knocking, a sound that now felt less like a warning and more like a plea from the countless dead of the M62. Some roads are haunted by rage, others by duty, but the A9, snaking through the stark, majestic glens of the Scottish Highlands, was haunted by a love so profound it had outlasted death itself. It was a love that walked the verges in the form of a woman forever. Searching, a spectral mother, known only as the Grey Lady. Her story was one of the most poignant Alex had yet encountered, a haunting born not of violence or vengeance, but of a grief so vast it had become a permanent feature of the landscape, as enduring as the granite peaks that watched over the long, lonely road. The A9 was a road of breathtaking beauty and sudden, treacherous moods. One moment the sun would be dazzling off locks as blue as sapphires. The next, a squall would sweep down from the mountains, veiling the world in a cold, driving rain. It was a place where the veil between the present and the past felt tissue-thin, where the sorrows of centuries seemed to seep from the very peat and heather. Alex felt it the moment he crossed into the highlands, a subtle shift in the air, a melancholy that hung over the soaring landscapes like a fine mist. His search for the ghost story led him to a small, whitewashed hotel nestled in a glen just off the A9, a place that catered to walkers and lost travelers. The owner, a kindly, silver-haired woman named Morag, with eyes the color of the winter sky, had become the unofficial chronicler of the Grey Lady. She welcomed Alex into a cozy sitting room where a peat fire crackled in the hearth, its smoky scent filling the air. Over a cup of strong, dark tea, her voice, soft with a Highland lilt, wove the tale of the forlorn spirit. The Grey Lady, Morag explained, was not a recent ghost. Her story was rooted in the brutal clearances of the 19th century, when landlords evicted countless families from their ancestral homes to make way for sheep. One such family, a mother, father, and their young daughter, were making the desperate cross-country trek to the coast to seek passage to a new life. They were caught in a ferocious blizzard on the high pass now traversed by the A9. In the blinding white chaos, the little girl, no more than 5 years old, became separated from her parents. The mother, her heart shattered, refused to leave. She searched until she collapsed and died of exposure, Her body found weeks later, when the snows melted, her arms still outstretched as if reaching for her lost child. And she's been searching ever since, Morag said, her gaze distant, fixed on the flames in the hearth. She doesn't appear to everyone, mostly to those who are lost themselves, either in the fog or in their lives. Drivers report seeing a woman in a long grey dress, her face pale and etched with worry, standing on the verge near a particular bend up on the pass. She doesn't try to stop the cars, she just looks. She looks into each one, her eyes scanning the interior, searching for a face she will never find. Some say she points, guiding lost drivers safely through the hazards, as if by helping them, she might somehow help her own child find the way home. Morag's stories were not dramatic accounts of terror, but quiet, chilling testimonials of a love that defied the grave. A trucker who saw her in his rearview mirror, her form fading as he drove away. A family on a holiday, lost in the fog, who swore a grey-clad woman had gestured them toward the correct turn-off before vanishing. The consistency was in the emotion she evoked, not fear, but a profound, heart-wrenching pity. Leaving the warmth of the hotel, Alex stepped out into a highland evening that was rapidly cooling. A fine, persistent drizzle began to fall, blurring the outlines of the mountains. He drove back onto the A9 and began the long, winding ascent toward the pass Morag had described. The higher he climbed, the more the weather closed in. The drizzle became a thick, clinging mist that flowed like a river through the glen, swallowing the peaks and reducing the world to the grey tarmac and the dark, spectral shapes of the heather-clad hillsides. He reached the bend, a notorious sharp curve where the road hugged the side of the mountain. It was a place of stark beauty and palpable sorrow. He slowed the car to a crawl. The mist was at its thickest here, coiling across the road in ghostly tendrils. And as he navigated the curve, a sudden deep chill seeped into the car. It was not the aggressive cold of Black Vaughan's rage, nor the holy frost of the monk. This was a different cold altogether, the bone-deep, desolate chill of a heart that had broken and never mended. It was the cold of a mother's love, frozen in a moment of ultimate loss. He felt it wrap around him, a sorrow so immense it was a physical presence, and he knew, with a certainty that tightened his throat, that he was in the presence of the Grey Lady. She was here, on this misty bend, her eternal vigil a silent scream of love into the highland silence. The cold was a sorrow made tangible, a grief that had seeped from a spectral heart into the very air of the car. It wrapped around Alex, not with malice, but with the immense, crushing weight of a loss that had lasted centuries. He guided the car around the sharp bend, the mist so thick it felt like driving through a cloud, the world reduced to a 10-foot bubble of grey tarmac, and the frantic rhythmic sweep of the wipers. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his breath pluming in the frigid air, every sense straining against the impenetrable whiteness. He was not just driving through a highland mist, he was driving through a mother's eternal anguish. And then, she was there. She materialized not with a shimmer or a fade, but with the sudden, heartbreaking solidity of a memory that would not die. One moment, the verge was empty. The next, a woman stood upon it, her form pale and distinct against the dark, wet heather. She was clad in a long grey dress of a coarse, homespun fabric, its hem trailing in the damp grass. Her hair was pulled back from a face that was gaunt with a worry that had become her permanent expression, her eyes wide and dark with a desperate, searching intensity. She was the Grey Lady, and she was looking directly at him. As his car drew level, her arm lifted. It was not a wave, nor a gesture of warning. It was a plea, one pale, slender hand extended, the fingers not pointing down the road, but toward the steep, mist-shrouded embankment that rose beside the bend. Her gaze, filled with a bottomless, silent beseeching, locked with his through the windscreen for a single searing second. In that moment, Alex felt the full, devastating force of her need, a need so vast and simple it transcended time and death. She was not asking for a ride, she was asking for help. And then, as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone. Her form dissolved into the swirling mist, leaving behind only the lingering desolate cold and the echo of her silent, desperate plea imprinted on his mind. He didn't hesitate. He couldn't. The command in her eyes had been absolute. He guided the car onto the next available patch of grass verge, a few dozen yards beyond the bend, and killed the engine. The silence rushed in, broken only by the patter of condensation on the roof and the frantic beating of his own heart. He stepped out into the chill, damp air, the mist clinging to his jacket like cold, ghostly fingers. He looked back toward the bend, but the road was empty, a grey ribbon disappearing into the white. Her gesture had been clear. She had pointed toward the mountain. He left the car and began to climb, his boots sinking into the soft, wet peat. The mist closed around him, swallowing the sound of the occasional car that passed below on the A9. The world was a monochrome palette of grey and green, the silence profound and heavy. He climbed for 10 minutes, his lungs burning in the thin, cold air, following no path but the memory of her pointing finger. The slope was steep, littered with loose stones and clumps of tough, springy heather. He was about to turn back, to rationalize the entire encounter as a trick of the mist and his own overwrought imagination, when his foot struck something hard and unyielding, half buried in the peat. He knelt, brushing away the wet moss and dirt. It was a stone, but not a natural one. It had been shaped by human hands. He cleared more earth, his fingers growing numb with the cold. It was a cross, a small, rough-hewn Celtic cross, its surface worn smooth by a century and a half of wind and rain. It was tilted at a sorrowful angle, as if the very earth were trying to reclaim it. Carved into the horizontal arm were 2 words, their Gaelic letters faint but still legible: Mo Nichéan, my daughter. Alex sat back on his heels, the cold of the peat seeping through his trousers, a different, deeper chill settling in his soul. This was not a grave marker for the mother. The stories said her body had been found and buried in a churchyard miles away. This was a memorial, a plea carved in stone. This was where she had last seen her child, where she had died searching. The cross was a testament, not to her death, but to her love, a love so fierce it had anchored her spirit to this spot for all eternity. The Grey Lady was not a lost soul. She was a mother, forever bound to the place she had lost her child, her ghostly form a perpetual searching presence on the road below, her silent gestures an attempt to guide the living to this forgotten, sorrowful shrine, to bear witness to a loss that time could not heal. He understood now. She wasn't asking for help to find peace for herself. She was asking for someone to remember her daughter. He reached out, his fingers tracing the cold, worn stone of the cross, a silent promise to the ghost and the child she would never stop seeking. Some roads are haunted by a single tragic moment, a crack in time through which a personal sorrow endlessly leaks. But the B6306, a narrow, lonely lane winding through the bleak, beautiful moorland of Northumberland, was haunted by an entire ceremony of grief. It was not a single ghost that walked here, but a procession of them, a phantom funeral that reenacted its sorrowful journey with the grim regularity of the seasons. The stories spoke of a line of mourners, dressed in the stark, formal black of a bygone century, crossing the road in a silent, stately parade, their faces pale and drawn with a century-old sorrow, their presence heralded by a whisper of static and prayer from a world of ether and dust. Alex felt the change as he turned off the main road and onto the B6306. The landscape opened up into a vast, treeless expanse of heather and coarse grass, broken only by the occasional outcrop of grey rock and the dark, sinuous line of dry stone walls. The sky was a low, leaden ceiling, threatening rain, and the wind moaned a constant, lonely dirge across the moors. It was a landscape made for mourning, a place where the sky pressed down on the earth as if sharing its grief. The air was sharp with the scent of peat and wet stone, and a profound silence lay over everything, a silence that felt less like an absence of sound and more like a held breath. He drove slowly, the narrow lane forcing a cautious pace. His research had been sparse. The legend of the phantom funeral was a local secret, passed down in whispers, not splashed across paranormal websites. He knew only the barest outline: a funeral procession from the late 1800s, a prominent local family struck by tragedy, their final journey to a remote hillside cemetery, now eternally replayed on this lonely stretch of road. The details were blurred by time, the names forgotten, but the sorrow, it seemed, was immortal. As dusk began to settle, staining the heather purple and the sky a deep bruised grey, he saw the first sign. It was not a visual apparition, but an aural one. The car's radio, tuned to a faint but clear classical station, suddenly dissolved into a hissing, crackling static. He reached to adjust it, but the static only grew louder, a chaotic white noise that filled the small space of the car. And then, within the hiss, a voice emerged. It was faint, distant, as if broadcast from the bottom of a man's voice, low and resonant, speaking words that were at first indistinct. Alex turned the volume up, his heart beginning to quicken. The voice resolved, chanting in a somber, monotone Latin. Requiem aeternam dona eis domin. Eternal rest grant unto them, O Lord. It was a prayer for the dead, a fragment of the Catholic funeral rite, whispered from a speaker that should have been playing Bach. A cold dread, different from any he had felt before, trickled down his spine. This was not the aggressive chill of a vengeful spirit, or the holy frost of the monk. This was the cold of the grave, the chill of a sorrow so institutionalized and formal it had its own liturgy. He killed the radio, but the static did not cease. It seemed to be coming from the car itself now, from the very air around him, the Latin prayer continuing its ghostly chant, a looped recording from a funeral that never ended. He rounded a gentle bend, and there they were. They were crossing the road ahead, a line of perhaps 24 figures, moving with a slow, funereal pace from the left-hand moor to the right. They were dressed uniformly in the heavy, formal black of the Victorian era. The men in long coats and top hats, the women in dresses that brushed the ground, their faces hidden by veils or shadowed by hat brims. Their forms were not fully solid. They had a translucent, wavering quality, like figures seen through old, warped glass. They made no sound as they walked, their feet leaving no impression on the damp tarmac. Their heads were bowed, their postures slumped with the weight of a shared, profound grief. They did not look at his car, did not acknowledge its blinding headlights or its idling engine. They were locked in their own moment, participants in a ritual of mourning that was playing out on a loop, independent of the modern world rushing blindly toward them. Alex brought the car to a complete stop, his breath fogging the cold air inside. He watched, mesmerized and horrified, as the silent parade filed past his bonnet. He could see the pale, grief-stricken faces of the men, the glint of tears on a woman's translucent cheek. They carried no coffin, but their collective sorrow was a heavier burden than any physical object could be. The last of the mourners, a tall, gaunt man who seemed to be the leader of the procession, stepped off the road and onto the opposite verge. He paused for a moment, his head still bowed, and then the entire apparition began to fade. They did not walk away into the heather, they simply dissolved, their forms unraveling like smoke, pulled apart by the moorland wind until the road was empty once more. The static in the car ceased abruptly, the Latin prayer cut off mid-syllable. The only sound was the tick of the cooling engine and the lonely moan of the wind. The sudden return to normalcy was as jarring as the apparition itself. Alex sat for a long time, staring at the empty road where the phantom funeral had crossed. He felt no fear now, only a deep, resonant pity. He pulled out his notebook, his hand trembling slightly, and began to write, not just the facts of what he had seen, but the feeling of it, the crushing weight of a century-old grief, made eternal on this lonely moorland road. The B-60C-306's haunting was not one of terror, but of remembrance, a ghostly ceremony ensuring that a long-forgotten sorrow would never, ever be completely gone. The ghost was a bride, forever suspended in the moment her joy curdled into tragedy. Alex had learned this from a weathered stonecutter in a pub near Newbury, a man who carved headstones for a living and knew the local dead better than the living. The A34, a major arterial road slicing through the soft green folds of Berkshire, seemed an unlikely place for such a delicate, sorrowful haunting. It was a road of speed and purpose, a dual carriageway where drivers focused on the horizon, not the verges. But the stonecutter's story had been specific, his details etched with the grim precision of his trade. A young woman, Eleanor Havisham, on her wedding day in 1923, the car carrying her to the church had been struck by a runaway lorry on a level crossing that was now buried beneath the modern A34. She had died in her white dress, the bouquet of lilies and roses still clutched in her hands, her life and future obliterated in a shriek of metal and a shower of glass and petals. Alex drove the A34 as evening settled, the sky awash of pale orange and violet. He watched, not for shadows or cold spots, but for a flash of white against the darkening hedgerows, a glimpse of a figure that did not belong to the world of tarmac and tail lights. The road was busy, a river of light flowing in both directions, the mundane reality of the commute, a stark contrast to the ethereal tragedy he sought. He passed the area the stonecutter had described, a long, straight stretch where the old level crossing would have been. Nothing, just the relentless flow of traffic, the hiss of tires on damp asphalt, the distant glow of Newbury ahead. It was on his third pass, as full darkness fell and the moon, a pale, thin sliver, rose above the trees, that he saw her. She was not on the verge. She was above the road, a figure of brilliant, glowing white, floating several feet in the air over the slow lane, her form as insubstantial as mist, yet holding the perfect shape of a woman in a flowing wedding gown. A delicate veil covered her face, but he could see the pale oval of her features beneath it, frozen in an expression of serene anticipation, untouched by the horror that was to come. She was beautiful and heartbreaking, a photograph from a lost album projected onto the night. She seemed to drift rather than float, moving with the same direction as the traffic, a silent, ghostly participant in the evening rush. Alex's breath caught. He signaled and moved into the lane behind her, slowing his speed to match her phantom drift. He expected her to fade, to vanish as the other. Apparitions had when directly approached, but she remained, a constant, luminous presence 20 yards ahead of his bonnet, her white dress seeming to generate its own soft internal light. He crept closer, his heart thudding with a strange mixture of dread and pity. He was within 10 yards, close enough to see the intricate lace on her sleeves, the way her veil stirred in a wind that did not touch the trees. He could almost make out the features of her face beneath the gauze, the hint of a smile that would never be fulfilled. And then, as his headlights seemed to finally touch the hem of her spectral gown, she dissolved. It was not a sudden disappearance, but a gentle unraveling. Her form broke apart into a million points of shimmering, opalescent light, like a dandelion clock blown apart by a breath. The points swirled in the air for a moment, a cloud of luminous dust, and then they too were gone. The space over the slow lane was empty, but she had left something behind. As the last of the shimmering motes faded, a scent flooded through the car's ventilation system, so sudden and potent it was as if someone had spritzed perfume directly into the vents. It was the unmistakable, heavy, sweet fragrance of lilies and old roses, the cloying funereal scent of a bridal bouquet. It was the scent of a wedding that had become a funeral, a beautiful, tragic aroma that filled the car and clung to the upholstery, a ghostly sachet left by a bride who would never reach the altar. Alex drove on. The sweet, sorrowful perfume his only companion, the image of the floating white lady burned into his mind. A spirit of lost love, forever drifting above the road where her happiness had ended, a poignant, beautiful, and utterly devastating reminder of a future that never was. The M1 was a scar of pure function, a 6-lane behemoth of concrete and asphalt built for speed and indifference. It was a road that denied its own history, its wide, modern lanes designed to erase the memory of the older, more meandering routes it had supplanted. But some histories are written in blood and metal, and no amount of engineering could fully pave over the echoes of violent death. The M1's haunting was not a single personalized ghost, but a collective catastrophic event, a replay of its deadliest crashes, a phantom pile-up that occurred not in space but in time, replaying on the anniversary of the tragedies that birthed it. It was a road that remembered its dead with a brutal cinematic clarity, and Alex had arrived on the one night it chose to remember. The air on the motorway felt different, charged with a static anticipation that had nothing to do with the weather. It was a clear, cold night, the sky a deep, star-flecked black, the moon a cold, watchful eye. The endless stream of headlights and taillights should have felt comforting, a river of shared human purpose. But to Alex, After the intimate sorrows of the Grey Lady and the White Lady, this felt impersonal and vast, a haunting on an industrial scale. He drove north, the city's glow fading in his rearview mirror, the darkness of the countryside pressing in. His research had been a grim catalogue of motorway mayhem, a multi-vehicle pile-up in 1991 that had claimed 7 lives, a horrific coach crash in the fog of 1972, a jackknifed lorry that had caused a chain reaction of fire and twisted metal in 2005. The dates were different, but the location was always the same, a long downhill stretch near Leicester, a place where speed and fate often collided. He reached the stretch as midnight approached. The traffic had thinned to occasional lonely vehicles. He pulled into the inside lane, reducing his speed to a crawl, his senses screaming. The digital recorder was on, the camera at the ready, but he felt the inadequacy of his tools. How did one capture an echo of an entire catastrophe? He drove on, the miles ticking by, the monotony of the road lulling him into a false sense of security. Perhaps he was wrong. Perhaps the anniversary had passed, or the legend was just that, a story to explain the random, brutal chaos of a motorway crash. Then the air ahead began to shimmer. It was not a mist or a fog. It was a heat haze distortion, but the night was cold. It wavered, a pocket of unstable reality hovering over lanes 2 and 3. Within that shimmer, lights began to flash. Not the steady red and white of modern vehicles, but the frantic, strobing orange of hazard lights from another decade. And then, the sounds began. Not the roar of his own engine, but the ghostly, overlapping symphony of a disaster unfolding. The screech of tires locking up, a sound that went on for far too long, layered over with the sickening, percussive thud of metal impacting metal, one after another, a gruesome, accelerating rhythm. He saw them then. Spectral cars and lorries, their forms translucent and glowing with a sickly, phosphorescent light, materializing within the shimmering air. A family saloon from the 1980s swerved violently, its ghostly tires leaving no mark on the tarmac, before being struck in the side by a phantom lorry that had materialized from nowhere. The impact was silent in its physics, but the sound of rending metal and shattering glass screamed in Alex's ears, a recording from the past playing at full volume in the present. Another car, a small boxy hatchback, was crushed between 2 larger phantoms, its roof buckling in a silent, horrifying collapse. And then came the screams. They were not a single voice, but a chorus, a cacophony of pure, undiluted terror and agony that seemed to come from the very air around him, from the vibrating steering wheel, from the seats of his car. They were the last sounds of the dying, trapped in their metal tombs, their final moments of panic and pain captured and replayed for an audience of one on this lonely stretch of motorway. A woman's high-pitched shriek was cut short abruptly, a man's guttural roar of fury and fear, the thin, desperate wail of a child. The sounds were not ghostly whispers, they were raw, immediate, and devastatingly human. Alex slammed on his brakes, his car shuddering to a halt on the hard shoulder. He sat, paralyzed, watching the ghostly carnage unfold 50 yards ahead. He saw a spectral figure, half out of a shattered windscreen, its form flickering, one arm raised in a final, futile gesture for help before it dissolved back into the chaos. He saw the ghost of a lorry cab, its front end concertinaed, a dark, smoky shape that might have been a driver slumped over its phantom wheel. The entire scene was a silent movie, with a devastatingly loud soundtrack, a loop of death and destruction playing out in a bubble of fractured time. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The shimmering air snapped back to normality. The phantom vehicles winked out of existence, the horrific symphony of crashes and screams cut off, leaving a silence that was ringing and absolute. The M1 was just a motorway again, dark and empty. A lone lorry rumbled past in the middle lane, its driver oblivious, its red tail lights shrinking into the distance. Alex sat there for a long time, his hands gripping the wheel, his body trembling not with fear, but with a profound, soul-sick horror. He had not encountered a ghost, he had witnessed a mass grave. He had seen the road's memory, its way of mourning its dead by forcing the living to see how they died. The M1 did not have a ghost, it had a scar, a psychic wound that bled these terrible echoes every year, a brutal recurring memorial to the lives ended too suddenly and violently on its unfeeling surface. It was a haunting of pure, senseless tragedy, a loop of final moments that served no purpose other than to remember, ensuring that the terrible price of speed and progress was never, ever completely forgotten. Some roads are haunted by sorrow, others by rage, but the A59, winding through the dark, wooded valleys of North Yorkshire, was haunted by an act of ultimate judicial violence. It was a haunting of pure, aristocratic terror, a spectre born not from accident or tragedy, but from the cold, deliberate fall of an executioner's axe. The headless horseman of the A59 was not a lost soul searching for peace. He was a stark, grisly monument to a power that had once been absolute and a punishment that had been brutally final. He was a reminder that some ghosts do not weep or plead, they simply charge, a rolling thunder of wrath and mutilation from a time when justice was as sharp as steel and as permanent as death. The A59 felt different from the moment Alex joined it from the harrowing, echoing chaos of the M1. The motorway, vast impersonal tragedy, was replaced by an intimate, looming dread. The road carved through deep, ancient woodlands, where the trees formed a dense, tangled canopy that blocked out the weak afternoon sun, casting the tarmac into a perpetual green-tinged twilight. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, rotting leaves, and something else, a faint metallic tang, like old iron or cold stone, that clung to the back of the throat. It was the smell of a castle dungeon, of a place where terrible things had been done and never forgotten. His research had been a grim dive into the bloody history of the English Civil War and its aftermath. The ghost was tied to a local royalist nobleman, Sir Edmund Blackwood, a man of fierce loyalty to the crown and a notoriously cruel temper. When the parliamentarians finally won, Sir Edmund had not been granted a soldier's death in battle. He had been captured, given a swift mockery of a trial, and publicly beheaded in the market square of the nearest town, as an example to other royalist sympathizers. But the legend said his spirit had not gone quietly to its reward. Denied a head in life, his ghost had risen without one, condemned to eternally ride the lanes of his former estate. Lanes now buried beneath the modern A59, on a monstrous, snorting stallion, itself as headless as its master. He was not searching for his head. He was a personification of the rage he had felt at its loss, a fury made manifest in hoofbeats and silent, charging aggression. Alex drove the winding road as dusk began to pool in the hollows between the hills. The woods pressed in close, their shadows deep and impenetrable. He passed a weathered stone marker, almost swallowed by ivy, that indicated the boundary of the old Blackwood estate. The atmosphere grew heavier, the air colder. The cheerful, mundane world of the nearby villages felt 1,000,000 miles away. He was on the ghost's land now, in his domain of shadow and memory. He drove slowly, his headlights probing the gathering gloom, every shadow at the edge of the beam seeming to shift and coalesce into the shape of a horse and rider. It began as a vibration, a deep rhythmic pounding that started as a faint tremor in the steering wheel and quickly grew into a thunder that shook the very chassis of the car. It was the sound of a gallop, but unlike any he had heard before. It was heavier, more powerful, a drumbeat of pure, unrestrained fury. It came from behind him, growing rapidly closer, a rolling wave of sound that promised annihilation. He glanced in the rearview mirror, his blood running cold. The road behind was empty, but the sound was upon him, a deafening phantom avalanche of hoofbeats that filled the car, vibrating through the seats and rattling the windows. He looked forward again, just in time to see it materialize on the road ahead, bursting from the wall of shadows as if tearing through a curtain from another time. The headless horseman. The sight was so grotesque, so fundamentally wrong that his mind recoiled. A massive black stallion, its muscles bunched and glistening with a spectral sweat, its powerful neck terminating in a ragged, bloody stump. It ran with a blind, furious energy, its hooves striking the asphalt in perfect, silent coordination with the deafening sound of the gallop that still filled the air, and astride it, a figure in the dark, ornate riding clothes of a 17th-century cavalier. The body was rigid with aristocratic pride and rage, one hand gripping the reins, the other holding a riding crop. And where the head should have been, there was only the frilled collar of a white shirt, dark with old blood, and the empty space above it. The headless rider charged directly toward his car, a projectile of nightmare fury. There was no time to think, only to act. Alex's hands, guided by a primal instinct for survival, wrenched the steering wheel hard to the right. The car swerved violently, tires screeching, mounting the grassy verge and lurching toward the dense tree line. The bulk of the phantom horse and rider passed by on the left, so close he felt the rush of its passage, a blast of air that was frigid and carried the scents of old leather, horse sweat, and the coppery reek of fresh blood. For a split second, the headless torso of Sir Edmund Blackwood was framed in his driver's side window, a horrifying silent portrait of aristocratic wrath. And then it was gone. The thunderous hoofbeats ceased as if switched off. The oppressive presence vanished. The air in the car warmed instantly. Alex fought to control the swerving vehicle, guiding it back onto the tarmac, his heart hammering against his ribs like a frantic bird. He pulled over, his body trembling uncontrollably, and stared into the rearview mirror. The road was empty. The spirit had not faded. It had simply ceased to be, its violent charge completed, its eternal point made. The next day, in a pub in the nearby village of Knaresborough, the locals confirmed the tale with a grim matter-of-factness that spoke of a story woven into the very fabric of the place. They spoke of Sir Edmund, of his pride and his cruel end, and of the headless spectre that had been seen for centuries, always charging, always furious. They tied the apparition directly to the executed noble from the 1700s, a man whose rage at his unjust and humiliating death had been so potent it had tattooed his final headless ride onto the road for all eternity. The headless horseman of the A59 was not a ghost of tragedy, but of vengeance, a perpetual silent scream of aristocratic fury against the dying of his light, forever charging down a road that had been built over his grave. The laughter of children should be a sound of pure, unburdened joy, a melody of life at its most innocent. But on the B4069, a narrow, hedgerow-lined lane in the heart of Oxfordshire, that laughter was a relic, a ghostly recording of a joy that had been brutally and permanently silenced. It was a sound that did not belong to the living, but to the long dead, and hearing it was to feel the chill of a tragedy so profound it had stained the very air. For Alex, still rattled by the visceral fury of the headless horseman, the transition to this new haunting was a descent from rage into a sorrow of an entirely different, more heartbreaking order. The B4069 was a road of gentle, rolling hills and picture postcard villages, a landscape of thatched cottages and ancient, honey-colored stone. It should have felt peaceful, bucolic. But as Alex turned onto it, the atmosphere felt heavy, weighted down by a memory the idyllic scenery could not conceal. The hedgerows were tall and thick, blocking the view, creating a winding, claustrophobic tunnel. The late afternoon sun, slanting through the leaves, cast dappled shadows that danced and flickered, playing tricks on the eyes, making every shift of light feel like a fleeting small form. He drove slowly, the name of the road's ghost whispering in his mind, the ghostly children. His research had been brief but devastating. The story was a local scar, a tragedy from the 1950s that was still spoken of in hushed, respectful tones. A school bus, filled with children returning home from a day trip, had been struck by a runaway lorry on a sharp bend of the B4069. The collision had been catastrophic, the bus rolling into a deep ditch, the impact and resulting fire claiming the lives of over 20 children. The bend had since been slightly altered, the ditch filled in, but the memory, it was said, had never been paved over. The children, in their eternal innocence, were still there, still playing, their spirits forever caught in the moment before the screech of tires and the shattering of glass. Alex approached the bend, his hands tight on the wheel. The road here was still tight, the hedgerows leaning in. The dappled light seemed to intensify, the shadows coalescing. And then he saw them. Not one or two, but a small group of them, 5 or 6 children, their forms translucent and shimmering in the sunbeams. They were in the middle of the lane, their backs to him, gathered in a circle. They were dressed in the simple, old-fashioned clothes of the 1950s, shorts and jumpers, pinafore dresses, and they were playing. A spectral red rubber ball arced through the air between them, thrown by a small laughing boy, caught by a girl with pigtails, her ghostly form hopping with glee. They were utterly absorbed in their game, a perfect frozen moment of childhood happiness playing out on the tarmac where they had died. His foot, acting on an instinct older than thought, slammed onto the brake pedal. The tires screeched, the car lurching to a violent, shuddering halt just 10 yards from the ethereal group. The sudden, harsh sound of reality, the skid, the groan of the brakes, seemed to shatter the ghostly tableau. As the car settled, the children vanished. They did not run, nor fade slowly. They simply winked out of existence, the red ball disappearing in mid-air, the circle of players dissolving into the sunbeams and shadows from which they had been woven. The lane was empty, silent and still, but the laughter did not stop. It continued, bubbling up from the empty road, a sound of pure, carefree joy that now felt like the most chilling sound he had ever heard. It echoed faintly, not from any specific direction, but from the air itself, from the leaves of the hedgerows, from the very tarmac. It was the sound of a game still in progress, a game that would never end, played by children who would never grow up. The laughter swirled around the stationary car for a long moment, a ghostly carousel of sound, before it too began to fade, drifting away on the warm afternoon air until the only sound left was the frantic thumping of his own heart and the ticking of his cooling engine. He sat there, breathless, his hands trembling on the wheel, staring at the empty spot where the children had been. The encounter had been brief, devoid of the terror of Black Vaughan or the grim spectacle of the M1's crashes, but it left him with a hollow, aching sadness that was somehow worse. Later, in a village pub whose walls were lined with photographs of local cricket teams and farming shows, he found an old man who remembered. The man's eyes grew distant and wet as he spoke of that day, of the smoke, the sirens, the unspeakable grief that had fallen over the valley. He confirmed it all, the school bus, the crash, the lost children. "They're not restless, not angry," the old man said, his voice thick with emotion. "They're just still playing. They don't know they're dead, you see. They're just happy, forever." And in that, Alex understood the true nature of the B4069's haunting. It was not a horror of pain or fear, but the profound, devastating tragedy of a happiness that was now a ghost, a laughter that was an echo, a game of catch played for eternity on a road that was their unwitting, eternal playground. The dread began not with a sight or a sound, but with a pressure, a subtle psychological weight that settled in the driver's seat beside Alex as he joined the A40 west of Oxford. This road, a major artery funneling traffic towards Wales, was haunted by a predator of a different breed. It was not a sorrowful mother or a vengeful nobleman. It was a machine, or the ghost of one, a phantom lorry whose legend was whispered in fearful tones at transport cafes and roadside pubs. It was a haunter that did not appear to warn or to mourn, but to chase, its immense silent bulk a catalyst for panic and a deadly, irresistible urge for speed. The stories were always the same, relayed by truckers with grim faces and eyes that had seen too much of the night. A driver, alone on the dark, dual carriageway stretches, would glance in their mirror to see the grille of an enormous articulated lorry riding their bumper, its headlights off, its cab a wall of darkness. No matter how they accelerated, the phantom would match their pace, sitting there, an immense, silent pressure at their back. But the true horror came when they looked again. The lorry would be gone, the road behind them empty for a mile. And then, a moment later, the pressure would return, the dark grille filling the mirror once more, having covered the impossible distance in the blink of an eye. It was a ghost that played with physics and perception, its reputation built on a string of real-world accidents. Cars found smashed in ditches and wrapped around trees, their drivers having apparently swerved or lost control in a frantic attempt to escape a pursuer that was never really there. Alex felt the legend's presence in the very texture of the evening air. The A40 was a road of long, sweeping curves and sudden, isolated stretches where the lights of civilization faded to pinpricks in the vast, dark countryside. He drove at a steady, legal speed, his eyes constantly flicking to the rearview mirror, his senses tuned to the space behind him. The first hour was uneventful, the traffic a steady, mundane flow. But as full darkness fell and the number of other vehicles dwindled, the atmosphere changed. The road felt longer, emptier, a stage being cleared for a single, terrifying performance. It began as a growing sense of being followed, a primal itch between his shoulder blades. He checked the mirror. Nothing. Just the receding red dots of a car a quarter-mile behind. He focused on the road ahead, the cat's eyes reflecting his headlights in a rhythmic, hypnotic pulse. The feeling persisted, growing stronger, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. He glanced again. This time, it was there, a colossal lorry. Its paintwork, a non-reflective, matte black that swallowed the light, filled the entire frame of his rearview mirror. It was so close he could see no details of its grille, just a wall of darkness that seemed to suck the light from his own tail lights. Its headlights were dead, its cab windows opaque, a void on wheels. There was no sound, no roar of a diesel engine, no hiss of air brakes, just silence, and the immense, pressing weight of its presence. A jolt of pure adrenaline shot through him. His foot, acting on an instinct older than reason, pressed down on the accelerator. The car surged forward, the engine note rising from a hum to a snarl. He watched the mirror, expecting the lorry to fall back. It didn't. It kept perfect pace, the same few feet of empty road separating them, its silent bulk an unshakable shadow. Panic, cold and sharp, began to claw at his throat. He pushed the pedal harder, the speedometer needle climbing past 80, then 90. The wind roared around the car, the steering growing light and sensitive. Still, the phantom lorry matched him, a silent, impossible companion in the night. He had to know. He had to be sure. Tearing his eyes from the road ahead for a split second, he snapped his head around to look through the rear window. The road behind was empty. A long, dark, perfectly straight stretch of tarmac, illuminated by his own receding tail lights, stretched out for at least a mile. There was no lorry, no vehicle of any kind. The pressure, the terrifying presence, had vanished the moment he turned his head. He faced forward again, his heart hammering, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He eased his foot off the accelerator, the car slowing back to a sane speed. The encounter had lasted less than 10 seconds, but it had left him trembling. It was just as the truckers had said. It disappeared when you looked back. He drove on, the empty road feeling more threatening than the phantom's presence had. The silence was no longer peaceful, it was a waiting silence. And then the pressure returned, the feeling of a massive weight crowding him from behind. He didn't want to look, he didn't need to. He knew what he would see. A glance at the mirror confirmed it. The black grille was there again, impossibly close, having bridged the vast distance in the moment his attention had lapsed. This time, a new sensation accompanied it. An insistent psychic urge, a silent command thrumming through the air that separated them. Faster, go faster. It was a compulsion, a siren call woven from fear itself, pushing him to flee, to outrun the inescapable. His right foot twitched, wanting to obey, to plunge the accelerator to the floor and let speed become his only reality. The phantom lorry was not just chasing him, it was herding him, using his own terror as a whip, urging him toward a velocity that could only end in a final, violent meeting with the unyielding landscape. The A40's ghost was a puppeteer of panic, and Alex, his hands slick with sweat on the wheel, was its terrified marionette, dancing on the edge of control on the dark, lonely road. The M25 was not a road haunted by a single tragic figure or a recurring spectral event. It was a haunting of a different magnitude entirely, a collective, a chorus of the damned. The London orbital was a vast, concrete noose strangling the capital, a perpetual motion machine of human frustration and modern angst, and its ghosts were not born of ancient history, but of the very stress and despair it generated. They were the suicides, the ones for whom the endless, looping grind had become a final, desperate exit. And they did not manifest as apparitions to be seen, but as whispers to be heard, pleas for help that rose not from the verges, but from the asphalt itself. a sonic haunting woven into the road's very fabric. Alex joined the motorway at junction 10, the sheer scale of the operation momentarily overwhelming. It was a world of its own, a roaring, multi-laned ecosystem of steel, concrete and light, where speed was dictated by the collective will of 100,000 strangers. The sky was a flat, oppressive grey, and a fine, persistent drizzle began to fall, smearing the grime on his windscreen and adding to the sense of claustrophobic gloom. He had heard the stories from urban explorers and late-night radio hosts, tales of drivers, alone in traffic jams, hearing faint, desperate voices whispering from the road, voices captured on recording devices as electronic voice phenomena, pleas for help from those who had chosen the hard shoulder as their final destination. He drove clockwise, the endless loops of junctions and interchanges a dizzying spectacle of modern engineering. The traffic was heavy, a slow, pulsating river of metal. For the first hour, there was nothing but the hiss of tires on wet tarmac, the thrum of engines, and the occasional blast of a horn. He kept his digital recorder on the passenger seat, its sensitive microphone theoretically capable of picking up sounds far below the threshold of human hearing. He felt foolish, a man trying to eavesdrop on a ghost in the middle of a roaring metropolis. The rational world, in all its noisy, petrol-fumed glory, seemed an impenetrable shield against the supernatural. Then, the traffic began to coagulate. A warning gantry flashed ahead, cues after junction 15. The river of cars slowed to a crawl, then stopped completely. He was trapped, boxed in by a white van on one side and a family saloon on the other, the relentless forward momentum of the motorway replaced by a stagnant, frustrating stillness. The rain pattered a monotonous rhythm on the roof. This was it. The conditions the legends described: isolation within a crowd, a bubble of forced quiet in the heart of the roar. It started as a vibration, not in the air, but in the bones of the car, a low-frequency hum that seemed to emanate from the road surface beneath his tires. He turned off the radio, the silence in the car suddenly feeling charged, expectant. The hum resolved, not into a sound, but into a feeling of pressure in his ears. And then he heard them. Whispers. They were faint at first, a susurration like dry leaves skittering across concrete, layered underneath the distant moan of idling engines. He couldn't make out words, only the cadence of human speech, pleading, frantic, overlapping. They seemed to come from directly below the car, rising through the floor pan, a subterranean chorus of anguish. He leaned forward, his ear almost against the steering wheel, straining to listen. "Help me." A woman's voice, thin and frayed, laced with tears. "Can't get out." A man, his tone flat with a final terrible resignation. "Tell Sarah I'm sorry. So dark here. Just let it end." The voices were not in the car with him. They were in the road. They were the M25 itself, speaking with the voices of those it had consumed. They were tied to the suicides, the jumpers from the footbridges, the ones who had stepped in front of lorries, the ones who had simply parked on the hard shoulder and never got out. Their final, desperate thoughts, their apologies, their goodbyes, had been absorbed by the miles of concrete and tarmac, and in the strange, silent pockets of a traffic jam, they leaked out, a psychic seepage of ultimate despair. His hands were clammy on the wheel. He reached for the digital recorder, his movements slow and deliberate, afraid that any sudden noise would break the fragile connection. He held it up, pointing it not at the window, but at the floor of the car. The little red light glowed, a tiny sentinel in the gloom. He let it run, capturing the ghostly whispers that wove through the sound of the idling engine and the pattering rain. The voices came in waves, sometimes a single clear phrase, other times a chaotic babble of lost souls, all pleading for a help that had come far too late. It was not a haunting to be seen, but to be heard, an oral tombstone for the hundreds whose final moments had been played out on this relentless looping road. He was sitting in the world's largest, most impersonal graveyard, and the dead were telling him their secrets. Some ghosts are born of personal tragedy, their sorrows etched into the very soil where they fell. Others are born of a greater, more collective cataclysm, their spirits bound not to a single grief, but to a nation's defining struggle. The A2, The old Roman road that carved its way through the Kentish countryside toward the Channel ports was haunted by such a spirit, a soldier. Not a Roman legionary marching to a forgotten drum, but a Tommy from the Second World War. A young man frozen in the moment he was meant to sail for France. His ghost a permanent sentinel on the road to war, a reminder of the millions who had passed this way, never to return. The transition from the frantic, modern despair of the M25 to the deep historical resonance of the A2 was a journey through layers of British memory. Alex left the orbital motorway's concrete roar behind, the landscape softening into the gentle green hills and hop fields of Kent. The road itself was older, its curves more graceful, following the lie of the land rather than brutally reshaping it. But this pastoral piece was a mask. This was the road to Dover, the gateway to the continent, the route along which countless armies, from the Romans to the Tommies of the British Expeditionary Force, had marched toward their destinies. The air, for all its apparent tranquility, felt heavy with the echoes of farewells and the ghost of collective anxiety. His research had been a dive into local archives and the memories of elderly residents. The stories were consistent, yet always delivered with a tone of solemn respect, not fear. On a particular stretch of the A2 near Canterbury, especially on foggy autumn mornings or still moonlit nights, a lone soldier would appear. He was always described the same way, a young man in the full battle dress of a World War II private, his kit bag slung over his shoulder, his rifle slung across his back. He never hitchhiked, never looked at passing cars. He simply stood at attention on the verge, facing the road, as if waiting for his transport, his gaze fixed on some distant historical horizon. Alex drove the road as the sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across the fields. He passed a weathered stone memorial to the local men who had fallen in the world wars, their names a stark list of lost futures. The atmosphere grew more poignant, more charged with unspoken history. He was not hunting a malevolent spirit, he was approaching a shrine. He parked his car in a secluded lay-by that veterans' accounts had pinpointed as the most frequent site of the apparition. He stepped out into the cool evening air, the scent of damp earth and cut grass filling his lungs. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant bleat of a sheep and the sigh of the wind through the barley. He didn't have to wait long. As the last light bled from the sky and the world turned to shades of blue and grey, the air on the verge ahead of him began to chill. It was a dry, clean cold, the cold of a concrete bunker or a pre-dawn muster. A patch of mist, unrelated to the clear weather, coalesced from nothing, swirling into a human shape. And then, he was there, the spectral soldier. He was as solid and real as the stories had claimed, his uniform crisp, his boots polished, his young face set in an expression of grim determination mixed with a profound, weary sadness. He stood at perfect attention, his eyes looking straight through Alex, focused on the road, on France, on the war that had taken him. For a long moment, the ghost remained motionless, a statue of duty and sacrifice. Then, slowly, deliberately, he moved. He did not fade or shimmer. He brought his right hand up in a sharp, formal salute. The gesture was not aimed at Alex, nor at the modern world. It was a salute to the past, to his comrades, to the cause for which he had given his life. It was a gesture of unwavering loyalty that had outlasted death itself. He held the salute for a count of 3, his arm rigid, his expression unchanging. And then, as Alex watched, breathless and humbled, the soldier's form began to dissolve. He did not vanish, but unraveled, his image softening at the edges, becoming transparent, until he was nothing more than a faint, glowing outline in the twilight, and then nothing at all. The cold dissipated, the air warmed, and the lay-by was just a lay-by once more. The following day, Alex sought confirmation, not from paranormal forums, but from the living who remembered. In a Royal British Legion club in a nearby village, he found them, old men with bright eyes and memories longer than the road itself. They nodded gravely as he described the soldier, the salute, the location. They had seen him too over the years. They called him their guardian, a boy who never got on the boat, forever watching over the road his brothers had travelled. Their accounts, steeped in a quiet patriotic pride and a bottomless sorrow for lost youth, confirmed everything. They felt no fear of him, only a profound connection to a past that was still, for them, painfully present. Driving away from the club, the image of the saluting soldier burned in Alex's mind. He felt no terror, only a deep, resonant and patriotic sorrow that tightened his throat and stung his eyes. This ghost was not a tragedy of one, but of a generation. He was the spirit of every young man who had kissed his sweetheart goodbye and marched down this road toward an uncertain future, the spirit of the promise and potential extinguished on the battlefields of Europe. The A2's spectral soldier was a monument, not of stone, but of memory, a permanent, silent sentinel whose salute was not a haunting, but a remembrance, an eternal tribute to the courage and the cost of a war that had defined a century. Some roads weep with the sorrow of ages, their grief seeping from the very soil and stone. The B4009, a slender, winding lane that traced the contours of a secluded river valley in the Cotswolds, was such a road. It was a place of profound feminine sorrow, a haunting not of rage or duty, but of a mother's love so vast its echo had never faded. The air here was different, heavy with a damp, cloying sadness that seemed to cling to the ancient limestone of the dry stone walls and the gnarled roots of the willow trees that wept into the slow-moving water. Alex felt the shift the moment he turned onto it, the frantic modern world falling away, replaced by a stillness that felt less like peace and more like a held breath, a landscape waiting for a lament that never ended. The stories were sparse, passed down in whispers through generations of the few families who lived in the isolated cottages dotted along the valley. They spoke of a woman, always heard, rarely seen. Her crying was the B4009's true ghost, a sound that would drift from the river mists on still evenings, a raw, gut-wrenching sob of a grief so absolute it seemed to stop the very birds from singing. It was a sound that bypassed the ears to lodge directly in the heart, a vocalization of a loss that time could not heal. Alex drove slowly, the narrow lane forcing a reverent pace. The river, a ribbon of silver glimpsed through the trees, gurgled softly, a mundane counterpoint to the spectral sorrow he sought. He parked near an old humpbacked stone bridge, a place the local law had marked as the epicenter of the haunting. He stepped out of the car into the cool, damp air, the scent of wet leaves and river mud thick in his nostrils. The evening was settling in, the sky a soft, bruised purple, the first stars pricking through the veil of twilight. He stood and listened, letting the silence of the place wash over him. And then he heard it. It began as a faint, choked whimper, so soft it was almost indistinguishable from the rustle of the willow leaves. But it grew, swelling into a full-throated, agonized weeping. Sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, from the deep shadows beneath the bridge, from the dark water of the river, from the very air itself. It was a woman's cry, laced with a despair so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing on his chest. It was the sound of a soul being torn in two, a raw, untempered anguish that had been repeating for centuries. He followed the sound, his footsteps quiet on the damp grass, his own breath held. He scanned the riverbank, the bridge's stone arch, the dense thickets of reeds. There was nothing, no pale figure, no shimmering apparition, just the sound, the devastating, lonely sound of a woman crying her heart out for a loss that was forever fresh. The weeping echoed under the stone bridge, magnified by the acoustics, creating a chorus of a single shattered heart. He stood there for a long time, a silent witness to this auditory ghost, the sorrow of it seeping into his bones until he felt a profound, empathetic ache deep within his own chest. The next morning, he found the answers in the tiny, stone-built post office of the nearest hamlet. The elderly postmistress, a woman with kind eyes and a face like a wrinkled apple, confirmed the legend with a sad nod. She told him of a young mother from the 17th century, a widow who had lived in a cottage long since washed away by floods. Her only child, a toddler, had wandered off while she was doing the washing by the river. The boy had fallen into the water and drowned, his small body found caught in the reeds downstream 2 days later. The mother, driven mad with grief, had haunted the riverbank ever since, her spirit forever searching, forever weeping for the child the river had taken from her. Her ghost was not one of sight, but of sound. Her eternal lament, the B4009's most poignant and heartbreaking landmark. That evening, Alex returned to the humpback bridge. The crying began again as the light failed, the same terrible familiar sobs rising from the mist over the water. This time, he did not search for a source. He understood now. He walked to the center of the bridge and leaned against the cold, damp stone of the parapet, looking down into the dark, swirling water. He bowed his head. He did not speak. No words could possibly suffice. He simply offered a moment of his own silence, a respectful shared space in time where he acknowledged her pain, her loss, her endless maternal love. He stood there for several minutes, a lone man on a dark bridge, listening to the ghost of a mother weep for her child. And as he stood in that silent vigil, something shifted. The raw, ragged edge of the sobbing seemed to soften. The agonized wails gentled into shuddering sighs, and then into a quiet, exhausted weeping. The terrible, crushing weight of the sound began to lift, not disappearing but changing, as if a storm of grief had finally spent its worst fury. After a few more minutes, the crying faded altogether, leaving behind only the natural sounds of the night, the gurgle of the river, the call of a distant owl, the sigh of the wind in the trees. The air felt lighter, cleaner, as if a poison had been drawn from it. The profound sorrow was still there, a permanent stain on the landscape, but the sharp, stabbing agony of it had momentarily eased. Alex felt it too, a subtle unclenching in his own heart. He had not laid the ghost to rest. Such a love could never truly rest. But for one night, on the B4009, he had offered a moment of companionship in her eternal solitude, and in doing so, had felt a fraction of her immense, timeless grief finally, gently, lift. The ghost was a flicker of loyalty that outlasted life itself, a love so steadfast it had refused to be undone by something as trivial as death. The A6, a road of long, weary stretches through the industrial heartlands and rolling hills of the Midlands, was haunted not by a person, but by a pet. It was a haunting of pure, uncomplicated devotion, a spirit whose only purpose was to run, a silent, phantom companion for those who travelled its length in the lonely hours. For Alex, still carrying the heavy maternal sorrow of the B4009, the idea of a ghostly dog felt almost comforting, a simpler, gentler kind of phantom. The A6 was a road of contrasts, passing through drab post-industrial towns before opening out into the soft green countryside of Derbyshire. It was an old road, its route etched long before the age of motorways, and it carried the weight of countless journeys in its worn tarmac. Alex drove it on a day of scudding grey clouds and fitful sunlight, the light changing constantly, making the world seem to shift and breathe. His research had been a patchwork of local anecdotes and faded newspaper clippings, the stories all centered on a specific stretch near the town of Bakewell, a long, straight section flanked by dry stone walls where a spectral dog, a large, shaggy-haired collie, was often seen running alongside cars, its form glowing with a faint internal light, its mouth open in a soundless, joyful bark. The legend, as pieced together from a chat with an old farmer in a Bakewell pub, was one of simple, heartbreaking loyalty. Decades ago, a farm dog named Shep had waited every evening at a gate for his master to return from the market in his truck. One night, the truck never came. The man had been killed in an accident on a different road. Shep, unable to understand, had waited. He waited for days, then weeks, then months, refusing to leave his post, watching every vehicle that passed, until he too eventually died of a broken heart, his body found by the gate. But his spirit, it was said, had never given up the vigil. Now he ran. He ran alongside every passing car, searching the windows for the face of his master, his eternal, hopeful energy a permanent fixture on the A6. Alex reached the stretch as the afternoon light began to fail, the sky turning a deep, watery blue. The dry stone walls were a dark, serrated line against the fading hills. He drove at a moderate pace, his eyes scanning the grassy verge. For a while, there was nothing but the hum of his engine and the whisper of the wind. Then, a movement caught his eye in the periphery. a flicker of white on the other side of the wall, keeping pace with the car. He slowed, his heart giving a small, curious leap. It was a dog, a beautiful, rough-coated collie, its fur glowing with a soft, moon-pale luminescence. It ran with an effortless, flowing grace, its legs a blur, its head held high, its tongue lolling in what should have been a pant of exertion, but made no sound. It was running alongside him, on the other side of the stone wall, its paws not touching the ground, but skimming just above the grass. It turned its head, and for a moment, its eyes, 2 points of gentle, intelligent light, met his through the passenger window. There was no menace in that gaze, only a kind of eager, questioning hope. Its mouth opened and closed in a series of silent, enthusiastic barks, a pantomime of greeting directed at the car, at him, at any potential master who might finally be the one to stop and take him home. The sight was so poignant, so filled with a simple, aching love, that Alex felt a lump form in his throat. He had faced the rage of Black Vaughan and the sorrow of the crying woman, but this quiet, steadfast devotion was somehow more powerful in its purity. The ghostly dog ran with him for 100 yards, a silent, glowing companion in the gathering dusk, a testament to a bond that not even the grave could break. And then, as the road began to curve, the collie reached a particular crumbling section of the wall. It did not jump over or fade away, it simply passed through the solid stone as if it were air, its luminous form flowing between the rocks and vanishing into the field beyond, its silent bark the last thing to disappear. Alex pulled over, the car idling roughly. He stared at the empty field where the dog had gone, the image of its hopeful, running form seared into his mind. The stories were true. The A6 was haunted by a ghost of unconditional love, a loyal pet killed long ago, whose spirit was forever chasing a reunion that would never come. A joyful, soundless bark echoing through the twilight for a master who was forever lost. It was a haunting not of terror, but of the most profound and enduring loyalty, a love that ran on, endlessly on the darkening road. Some roads were haunted by rage, others by sorrow, but the M4, the great concrete ribbon stretching west from London, was haunted by the land itself. It was a haunting, not of history, but of prehistory, a memory of the earth that rose from the ancient, waterlogged ground to reclaim the modern world for a few terrifying minutes. The stories spoke not of a ghost, but of a fog that was not weather, but a phenomenon, a sentient mist that rolled in from the surrounding marshlands with an intelligence and a purpose all its own. It was a fog that did not obscure, but revealed things that should have remained hidden, a swirling grey veil pulled back from a time before tarmac and tires. Alex felt the change as he left the sprawling suburbs behind and entered the flat, wide expanse of the Thames Valley. The M4 here was a monument to speed and efficiency, a straight shot towards the West Country, but the land on either side was ancient and stubbornly wet. Drainage ditches glittered in the low afternoon sun, and the air carried the faint, peaty scent of the old marshlands that had once dominated this landscape, lands that had been drained and paved over but never truly tamed. His research had been a foray into local geology and folklore, a combination that spoke of a peculiar, localized fog bank that would appear with unnatural speed, even on clear days, on a specific stretch near Swindon. Within its depths, drivers reported seeing shapes, tall, slender, and impossibly fast, darting between the lanes and hearing wet, slapping sounds against their cars, as if something were moving through the mist just outside their windows. He drove into the setting sun, its glare a blinding orange smear on his windscreen. The traffic was heavy, a relentless river of commuters and lorries. For the first hour, there was no sign of anything unusual, just the mundane, roaring reality of a busy motorway. But as he passed the junction for Swindon, the air ahead began to look wrong. The horizon, which should have been sharp and clear in the dry air, was smudged. A wall of thick, yellowish-grey fog was boiling up from the fields to the south, spilling over the crash barriers and flowing across the lanes with a speed that was utterly unnatural. It wasn't drifting, it was advancing, a silent, rolling tide of vapor that swallowed the cars ahead of him whole. their tail lights winking out one by one as they were engulfed. A cold dread, different from any he had felt before, tightened in his chest. This was not the holy chill of the monk or the grave cold of the funeral. This was a primeval damp, the chill of deep, still water and rotting vegetation. He had no time to react. The fog hit his car like a wave, the world outside vanishing in an instant, replaced by a swirling, opaque murk that reduced visibility to zero. His headlights became useless, their beams reflecting back at him, creating a disorienting, luminous cage. The sounds of the motorway, the roar of engines, the hiss of tires, were instantly muffled, replaced by a profound, wet silence that was somehow louder than any noise. He slowed to a crawl, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his senses screaming. The fog pressed against the glass, thick and heavy, and within its depths, things moved. They were not the human silhouettes of the M62, but something else. Tall, slender, wavering shapes, like walking reeds or the legs of wading birds magnified to a monstrous scale. They darted through the grey with a fluid, impossible speed, crossing the lanes ahead and behind, their forms indistinct but undeniably alive, with a purpose that was alien and deeply unsettling. A loud, wet thwack struck the passenger side door, the impact shuddering through the frame, as if a heavy sodden branch had been slapped against the metal. Then another on the roof. Thump. They were testing the car, probing its shell. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at his throat. He was blind, trapped in a silent, rolling world that belonged to something else. He couldn't stop. To stop was to become a permanent fixture in this phantom marsh. He pressed on, the car creeping forward at walking pace, the shapes flitting through the periphery of his blurred vision, the wet impacts continuing sporadically against the windows and bodywork. It felt like he was driving through a herd of spectral, amphibious giants, their forms woven from the mist and the memory of the lost wetlands. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The fog simply dissolved, the swirling grey walls pulling back to reveal the clear, open motorway ahead. The transition was so abrupt it was jarring. The sun was still shining, the traffic was still flowing, and the world was normal again. He accelerated, his heart hammering, desperate to put distance between himself and that cursed stretch of road. In his rearview mirror, the patch of fog was already gone, the air clear as if it had never been. Shaken, he pulled into the next service station. His hands were still trembling as he bought a coffee and sought out a local trucker at a nearby table. The man, a grizzled veteran of the M4, listened to Alex's breathless account and nodded grimly. "The marsh fog," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It's not a ghost, son. It's the land remembering. That whole stretch was marshland once, a proper bog, drained hundreds of years ago to build the road. But some days, when the conditions are right, the old land reasserts itself. That fog, it's not weather, it's a memory. And the things you see in it, they're what lived there, or the echo of what lived there, from a time before this was a road at all. The phenomenon," he explained, "was a known, if rare, event. A ghost not of people, but of place, a fleeting resurrection of the ancient marshlands that rose from the soil to remind the modern world of what lay beneath the concrete and tarmac. The A11 cut through the flat, open lands of East Anglia, a straight grey line under a vast bowl-like sky. After the primeval terror of the M4's marsh fog, this landscape felt exposed, its secrets laid bare to the heavens. The haunting here was a classic, one Alex had encountered before in different forms, but each iteration held its own unique, chilling signature. The A11's version of the vanishing hitchhiker was not a girl in a summer dress or a silent, desperate man, but something else entirely, a fragment of a life interrupted, a mystery from the 1980s that had never been solved. He drove as the short winter day began to fail, the sun a cold orange disk sinking into the endless fields of black earth and stubble. The road was quiet, the traffic sparse, the few other cars feeling like isolated ships on a calm grey sea. His research had been frustratingly vague, a missing persons report from 1985, a young man named Michael Priestley, last seen hitchhiking on this very road after a fallout with his girlfriend. He had vanished without a trace, his case grown cold and dusty in police archives, kept alive only by the determination of a retired detective and the occasional unverified sighting of a lone male hitchhiker who disappeared from the cars of those foolish or kind enough to stop. The light bled from the sky, leaving a deep, star-dusted twilight. Alex saw the figure ahead, a dark silhouette against the gloom, standing beneath a lone skeletal tree that marked the entrance to a long-abandoned farm track. The hitchhiker's arm was raised, the gesture one of weary hope. As Alex drew closer, his headlights illuminated the man. He was young, perhaps in his early 20s, dressed in the faded denim and scuffed leather jacket of another era. His hair was long, shaggy, in the style of the mid-80s. His face was pale, his expression one of simple, tired gratitude, as Alex slowed the car and pulled over. The young man opened the passenger door and slid in, the interior light flickering briefly across his translucent form. He brought with him a wave of cold air that smelled of damp earth and faintly of hairspray and stale cigarette smoke, the ghost of a 1980s night out. He nodded a silent thanks, buckling a seatbelt that his spectral form seemed to phase through. Alex pulled back onto the dark road, the silence in the car profound and heavy. He glanced at his passenger, who stared straight ahead, his hands resting on his knees. Alex's mind raced, trying to formulate a question, a way to break the silence without startling the apparition. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud. "Rough night?" he began, his voice hesitant. The hitchhiker turned his head, a small, weary smile touching his lips. He opened his mouth to speak, his form beginning to flicker, the edges of his jacket and hair dissolving into a fine, glowing mist. "You wouldn't believe," he started, his voice a faint, echoing whisper, and then he was gone. Not with a fade or a shimmer, but with the abrupt finality of a switched-off television screen. One moment he was there, mid-sentence, the next, the passenger seat was empty. The cold vanished, the smell of hairspray dissipating into nothingness. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the rush of the wind outside. Alex's heart thudded against his ribs. He swerved slightly, his hands gripping the wheel as he fought to control his surprise. He pulled over, onto the grassy verge, the car rocking to a halt. He stared at the vacant seat, the ghost of the young man's words, "You wouldn't believe," hanging in the air like a promise of a story that would never be told. It was a cruel tease, a fragment of a conversation from beyond the grave. His eyes dropped to the footwell of the passenger seat. Something lay there, a small rectangular piece of paper that had not been there before. He reached over, his fingers closing around it. It was a ticket stub, faded and yellowed with age. He held it up to the dashboard light. The printing was bleached but still legible. It was for a cinema in Norwich, dated October 12, 1985. The film was Back to the Future, and scrawled in biro on the back, in a looping, youthful hand, was a name, Melissa, and a phone number that was 2 digits short, as if written in haste. The stub was ice cold, a solid piece of the past left behind by a ghost. It was a connection, a tangible clue dropped into his lap by the vanishing hitchhiker. Michael Priestley. This was his ghost. He had been on his way back from a date, from a film about time travel, his future stretching out before him, when his own time had simply stopped. The ticket stub was the key, the piece of evidence that tied the spectral form to the cold case file. The A11's hitchhiker wasn't just a random apparition, he was a specific young man with a name, a history, and a lost future, forever thumbing a ride on the road where he disappeared, leaving behind this tiny, chilling artifact of the life he never got to live. Some roads promise terror, others sorrow, but the B3078, a narrow, unassuming lane threading through the dark, mineral heart of Dorset, offered something else entirely, a fragile, flickering hope. It was a road where the supernatural was not a predator, but a guide, a single benevolent spark in an otherwise pitiless darkness. The stories spoke not of a ghost to be feared, but of a light to be followed, a ghostly bobbing lantern that appeared to lost travelers, leading them safely through the labyrinth of hazards that riddled this ancient landscape. After the chilling, abrupt departure of the A11's hitchhiker, the promise of a protective spirit felt like a balm, a whisper of grace in a world of echoing sorrows. The B3078 felt old, its tarmac laid over a history measured not in centuries but in millennia. It wound through a region pockmarked with the ghosts of industry, old clay pits that had become dark, silent lakes and the skeletal remains of mine workings, their rusted headframes clawing at the sky like the bones of long-dead giants. This was a land that had been hollowed out, its wealth extracted, leaving behind a treacherous, unstable terrain of hidden shafts and sudden subsidences. The road itself was a dare, a ribbon of modernity stretched taut over a landscape that was perpetually threatening to collapse back into the past. The air carried the faint metallic tang of old iron and the damp, cold smell of deep earth. Alex drove the lane as a thick, pea-soup fog, a common companion in these low-lying parts, began to coil up from the damp ground. It swallowed the world with a swift, silent finality, reducing his universe to the few feet of tarmac, illuminated by his struggling headlights. The familiar landmarks, a lone gnarled oak, a crumbling stone wall, vanished into the swirling grey. He slowed to a crawl, the fog so dense it felt like driving through wet cotton wool. He was lost, completely and utterly, the road ahead and behind a uniform, disorienting whiteness. A wrong turn here, a slight drift onto the soft verge, could mean a broken axle in a hidden ditch, or worse, a plunge into one of the old, unmarked mine shafts that locals whispered riddled the fields. A cold knot of genuine, practical fear tightened in his stomach. This was not a supernatural terror, but the very real, very mundane fear of being stranded in an inhospitable place. He inched forward, his knuckles white on the wheel, his eyes straining against the impenetrable murk. And then he saw it, a light, a small, warm, yellow orb hovering in the fog about 50 yards ahead. It was not the harsh white of a car's headlight or the sterile blue of modern lead. It was the soft, wavering glow of an oil lamp, the kind a man might carry, bobbing gently up and down as if held in a walking hand. His first instinct was caution, born of too many encounters with deceptive phantoms. But the light did not vanish or shift menacingly. It simply hung there, a beacon in the grey, and then it began to move forward, maintaining its distance, a steady, inviting guide. There was no choice. To stay still was to be trapped. To go forward blindly was folly. The light was offering a path. With a deep breath, he eased his foot onto the accelerator, allowing the car to creep forward, keeping the glowing orb centered in his windscreen. The ghostly light led him on a winding, seemingly illogical route through the fog. It would slow almost to a stop before a bend he couldn't see, then speed up on a straight he didn't know was there. At one point, it drifted sharply to the left, guiding him away from the center of the lane. As he followed its lead, his offside wheels crunched over loose gravel and a deep, rain-filled pothole that would have surely damaged his car had he hit it at speed. The light had not just been showing him the way, it had been showing him the safe way. It weaved him around unseen hazards, its gentle bob, and weave a silent, expert navigation through the treacherous landscape. The oppressive, claustrophobic fear began to recede, replaced by a dawning sense of wonder and gratitude. He was no longer lost, he was being led. For nearly 20 minutes, the lantern was his sole companion, a dancing will-o'-the-wisp with a purpose. And then, as abruptly as the fog had descended, it began to thin. The outlines of hedgerows solidified, the dark shape of a barn emerged to his right, and the distant welcoming lights of a village sparkled ahead. The ghostly light slowed, bobbed gently in place for a moment, as if in a final, silent farewell, and then simply winked out. It didn't fade, it was just gone, its duty fulfilled. Alex drove the last few hundred yards out of the fog and into the clear, star-dusted night, pulling over at the first safe spot to catch his breath. The next morning, in a village pub whose walls were lined with photographs of local miners, he found the explanation. The old men nursing their pints nodded sagely when he described the bobbing yellow light. The miner's lamp, one of them said, his voice raspy from a lifetime of dust. That'll be old Jacob. He worked the pits hereabouts long before they were closed. Died in a collapse in, must be 1890. They say his spirit stays on, guiding folks who get lost in the fog on the old track he used to walk to and from the mine. Doesn't like to see anyone come to harm on his road. The folklore was clear and consistent. The light was a miner's lamp, its bearer a kind-hearted soul still performing his final, earthly duty, guiding lost travelers safely home through the dark and the fog, a solitary flickering point of kindness in the vast haunted tapestry of Britain's roads. The A7 unspooled before him like a grey thread stitched through the rumpled green velvet of the Scottish borders, a road of lonely beauty and sudden sweeping vistas. After the guiding grace of the B3078's miner's lamp, this landscape felt raw and untamed, its emptiness a canvas for a different kind of spectral encounter. The air was sharp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and wet heather, a stark contrast to the cloying, metallic fog of the Dorset Hollows. Alex drove with a weary familiarity, his senses attuned now, not just to the possibility of the supernatural, but to its specific local flavor. The A7's legend was a quiet one, less about terror and more about a simple, urgent warning from the past. The stories, gleaned from a shepherd in a Howick pub, spoke of a man, not a soldier or a nobleman, but an ordinary man, dressed in the rough tweed clothing of a late Victorian farmer or labourer. He would appear on the verge, usually on a blind corner or at the crest of a steep hill, his form solid and startlingly real. He never attempted to hitch a ride or speak. His purpose was singular and clear. He would step to the edge of the tarmac, his face etched with a desperate urgency, and point. He would point emphatically down the road, ahead of the driver, his arm outstretched, his finger directing attention to a specific, unseen spot. And then, as the driver drew near, he would vanish, dissolving into the clear border air as if he had never been. Those who heeded his warning, who slowed and approached the indicated spot with caution, would invariably discover a hidden hazard, a landslide blocking the lane, a sheep stranded in the road, a collapsed drain hidden by a dip. The apparition was a sentinel, a ghostly guardian, whose only role was to prevent a repeat of whatever tragedy had originally claimed him. Alex drove the winding road as the afternoon sun cast long, dramatic shadows across the hills. The landscape was a series of steep, rolling valleys, the road clinging to their sides, offering breathtaking views that could easily distract a driver from the sharp, hidden bends. He was looking for a specific stretch the shepherd had described, a notorious blind summit near Selkirk, where the apparition was most frequently seen. The sky was a vast, cloudless blue, the light so clear it felt like it could cut glass. It was in this brilliant, unghostly daylight that he saw him. One moment the road ahead was empty. The next, a man was standing on the left-hand verge, just before the road curved sharply out of sight over the rise. He was there with the jarring solidity of a living person, his boots planted firmly on the grass, his tweed jacket buttoned against a chill only he could feel. His face was weathered and lined, his hair thick and grey, and his eyes were fixed on Alex's approaching car with an intensity that was almost physical. As the car closed the distance, the man took a swift step forward to the very edge of the tarmac. His right arm shot out, his hand rigid, his index finger pointing with a fierce, silent insistence directly ahead, over the crest of the hill. His mouth was a tight, grim line, his entire being focused on this one vital act of communication. Alex's foot instinctively lifted from the accelerator, his body responding to the raw urgency in the apparition's gesture before his mind could process its impossibility. He slowed the car to a crawl, his eyes locked on the man, expecting him to fade. But he remained, solid and real, his pointing arm unwavering, his gaze burning into Alex's own. He held the pose until Alex's car was almost upon him, and then, between one blink and the next, he was gone. Not a fade, not a dissolve, but a simple, absolute cessation. The space on the verge was empty, the only movement the wind rustling the heather where he had stood. The warning, however, remained, hanging in the air like a spoken command. Alex guided the car cautiously over the blind summit, his muscles tense, his senses screaming, And there it was, just around the bend. A large moss-covered boulder, dislodged from the hillside by recent rains, lay squarely in his lane. It was half obscured by the curve of the road, a brutal, immovable object that would have torn the front end from his car had he been traveling at any sort of speed. He had just enough room to swerve gently into the oncoming lane, which was, mercifully, empty, and navigate around it. His heart hammered not with terror, but with a surge of profound, disbelieving gratitude. He pulled over a short distance beyond the rock, his hands trembling slightly on the wheel. He looked back at the empty stretch of road, at the spot where the apparition had stood. The rational part of his mind, the part that had once built a career on skepticism, had been utterly silenced. There was no explanation, no trick of the light. A ghost, a man from another century, had just saved him from a serious, potentially fatal accident. The A7's apparition was not a phantom of sorrow or rage, but one of simple, practical benevolence. He was a watchman, a guide of a different sort, his eternal penance or purpose to stand on that dangerous bend and point the way to safety, a silent, steadfast guardian in old tweed and grit, whose only language was a pointing finger, and whose only reward was the knowledge that, for one more driver, his warning had been heeded. The transition from the benevolent guidance of the A7's phantom to the grim, percussive reality of the M8 was a descent from grace into a grinding industrial purgatory. Scotland's busiest motorway, arrowing through the urban heartland between Glasgow and Edinburgh, was not haunted by a single soul or a guiding light, but by the accumulated weight of its own violent history. It was a road that remembered every impact, every shriek of twisting metal, every life extinguished on its rain-slicked surface. Its ghosts were not figures to be seen, but sounds to be heard and sensations to be felt, a symphony of catastrophe playing on an endless loop beneath the roar of modern traffic. Alex joined the M8 as a persistent, grey drizzle began to fall, smearing the already grim landscape of industrial estates and sprawling retail parks into a monochrome blur. The air inside the car grew heavy, not with a supernatural chill, but with a leaden dread that seemed to seep from the very concrete of the elevated sections. This was a road of function and haste, where the relentless push toward destination overrode any sense of journey, a perfect breeding ground for the echoes of moments when that haste had turned fatal. He drove east, the traffic a dense, rumbling beast around him. At first, there was only the mundane orchestra of the motorway, the thrum of tires, the growl of engines, the rhythmic swipe of his wipers. But as he passed the towering gantries near the Kingston Bridge, the air began to change. A faint, high-pitched screech, like tortured metal, threaded its way through the noise, there and gone so quickly he thought it might be a faulty brake pad on a nearby lorry. Then came a dull, percussive thump, felt more through the chassis than heard, a phantom impact that had no source in the flowing river of traffic. The sounds were not loud, but they were wrong, dissonant notes in the motorway's familiar score. He saw them then, not as solid forms, but as fleeting distortions in the rain and spray kicked up by 1,000 wheels. A shimmering outline of a hatchback, its form like heat haze, swerved violently in the lane beside him before dissolving into the grey downpour. A moment later, the ghostly trailer of an articulated lorry jackknifed in his rearview mirror, a silent, ethereal replay of a disaster from years past. They were not full apparitions, but after-images, brief, violent stains on reality that flickered and vanished, leaving behind only the echo of their presence and a sudden, sharp drop in temperature that misted his windows from the inside. Alex understood with a cold, grim certainty that settled in his gut. The M8 was not haunted by spirits seeking peace or revenge. It was a memorial, a vast, unwitting cenotaph made of asphalt and concrete. It absorbed the energy of every crash, the terror of every final moment, and in certain conditions, under the press of the right atmospheric pressure and the weight of so much human passage, it played them back. These were not ghosts of the dead, but ghosts of the accidents themselves, the road's own traumatic memories made audible and visible. It was remembering its pain, forcing anyone sensitive enough to witness the brutal cost of the speed and indifference that was its daily reality. He pulled into a service station, the phantom sounds still ringing faintly in his ears. the ghostly cars imprinted on his vision. The normalcy of the brightly lit forecourt, the smell of fried food and coffee, felt like a flimsy lie. He sat in his car, watching the living world go about its business, and felt the profound sorrow of the road beneath him. It was a sorrow without a face, a grief that belonged to the tarmac itself. Before rejoining the motorway, he opened his glove compartment. Among the maps and receipts, his fingers found a small, smooth stone he had picked up on a beach in Northumberland a lifetime ago, when his quest had just begun. It was just a stone, grey and unremarkable, but it felt solid and real, an anchor from a world that was not made of echoes. He stepped out into the drizzle, walked to the edge of the service area, where it met the motorway fence, and placed the stone carefully at the base of a lamppost, its light a futile attempt to push back the gloom. It was not a tribute to a specific person, for the M8's dead were legion and anonymous. It was a tribute to their collective memory, a small, solid piece of the natural world left as an offering to the man-made one, a silent acknowledgement of the countless tragedies absorbed by this relentless road. He got back in his car and drove on, the echoes of accidents fading behind him, leaving only the steady drum of the rain and the heavy, honourable silence of his own respect. The final miles unspooled before him, a grey ribbon, leading not toward another spectral horror, but toward the quiet conclusion of a journey that had remade his world. Alex drove, the hum of the engine a familiar, almost meditative sound, but the man listening to it was not the same. One who had set out with a journalist's skepticism and a friend's desperate hope. That man was gone, his certainty shattered on the cold passenger seat of the A1. His disbelief drowned in the screaming silence of the B1225, his fear conquered on the dark, horse-charged stretch of the A59. In his place was someone quieter, humbled, his mind a vast echoing gallery filled with the faces and voices of Britain's restless dead. He no longer saw the landscape as mere scenery. Every bend held a memory, every stretch of verge a story. The whispering trees of Surrey recalled the headless charge of a nobleman's rage. The misty moors of the Pennines wept with the collective sorrow of the fog-bound lost. The ancient, straight roads of the Romans still echoed with the marching tread of a legionary's eternal duty. The roads were not just strips of tarmac. They were living, breathing archives of the nation's soul, layered with grief, love, duty, and vengeance in equal measure. He had started this quest seeking a single friend, but he had found a whole country of the departed, each one a thread in a tapestry of haunting that was far richer and more complex than he could ever have imagined. His vow was silent, but ironclad, etched into his heart with the same permanence as the ghostly tales were etched upon the land. He would share these stories, but he would do so with a reverence he had once mocked. They were not fodder for sensational headlines or campfire scares. They were the last testament of the lost, the final lingering echo of lives interrupted. The vanishing hitchhiker was not a spooky anecdote. She was a young woman forever trying to get home. The grey lady was not a generic spectre. She was a mother whose love had outlasted death itself. To treat their stories with anything less than respect would be a betrayal of the truths they had seared into him. As the first familiar landmarks of his own life began to appear on the horizon, he did not feel a sense of relief or a return to normality. Instead, he felt a connection, a thin, vibrant cord that now tied him to the roads he had travelled. He could feel them, even now, the lingering spirits, the echoes of accidents, the steadfast guardians. They were not behind him, they were with him. The phantom lorry's pressure, the monk's holy chill, the miner's lamp's hopeful glow. They were all part of him now, a permanent constellation of otherworldly experiences mapped across his consciousness. The haunted roads of Britain had not just been a subject of investigation, they had become a part of his own history, their lingering spirits silent, unseen companions on his own journey home. He was no longer just a man who had seen ghosts. He was a man who understood that the past is never truly past, and that the road home is just one of many, all of them travelled by the living, and all of them watched over by the dead.